00031. Brain surgery? Fury was in his office, and he couldn't control the smile he had. He couldn't help it. He was happy. The skill Ezekiel used to bring back Zola was impossible, and yet it worked. The interrogation they performed, if they could even call it that, was one of the shortest he had ever done. Normally it takes days or weeks to break someone. Sleep deprivation was the best way. Torture never worked well. People would say anything to make the torture stop. But when you take away someone's ability to sleep for an extended period of time, they easily talk. They tell you stuff you didn't even ask about. It just took time, and if you weren't careful, you would kill them from lack of sleep. But now Fury had another option to use. Ezekiel warned him that they couldn't abuse the power because he didn't know how the aspect of death would react to it. Fury didn't mind. If they used it only when they were sure they could get important information, like with Zola, then it wouldn't matter. Fury turned on his computer and started to go over all the information they had obtained from Zola. He now had more than one target and had to start planning. Ezekiel had said they still needed to wait, but Fury liked to be proactive. If he could take a few pieces off the board with some accidents, who would know? Logan was sitting in a beach chair, relaxing in the backyard of the mansion. He was wearing shorts and a t-shirt. There was an ice chest of beer next to him, and he had a cigar in his mouth. He reached up and removed the cigar from his mouth as he said, "What are you doing here?" "Charles, Ezekiel is here." Ezekiel had a smile on his face as he walked in front of Logan and said, "I came because a mutual friend of ours asked to see you." "I know. He asked to talk to you about meeting someone." Logan sat up and looked around. It was only him and Ezekiel in the backyard currently. He looked back at Ezekiel and said, "If they wanted to see me, they aren't making much of an effort." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Unfortunately, he is currently living under special circumstances and can only travel to a handful of places. So unless you visit him, he won't be able to meet you." Logan sits there for a few moments as he talks to Xavier. "He wants me to go somewhere to meet this person. From all of our interaction with him, I don't think it is a trap. If you go, I will try to trace the location using Cerebro." "All right." Logan stood up and said, "All right, let's go." Ezekiel smiled as he snapped his fingers, and a portal appeared next to him. He started to walk through the portal and said, "You can bring your beer if you want. Just make sure you collect your trash before you leave." Logan grunted in response as he put the cigar back in his mouth, before he picked up his ice chest and followed Ezekiel into the portal. As the portal closed behind him, Logan looked around and was surprised that they were on a beach and it was early morning, with the sun coming up from the east side of the island. There were some beach chairs and lounge chairs set out under some lean-tos, what looked like a tiki bar, a pit for a bonfire, and a cooking pit next to that. Logan took a big inhale and asked, "So where are we? Some kind of beach resort? And where is this person who wants to talk with me?" "Something like that. This island is hidden from the rest of the world, and until recently it wasn't used. I asked the owner if I could use it for a while, and they agreed. As for our friend, he should be here in a bit." Ezekiel walked over to a chair and sat down, before he turned to look at Logan and asked, "If I could help you restore your memories, would you let me help you?" Logan walked over to a lounge chair, set his ice chest next to it, and then laid down on it. After a few minutes of silence, he asked, "What makes you think you could help me where Charles wasn't able to?" "I would start by taking the bullet out of your head for starters." Logan looked over to Ezekiel and said, "My skull is coated in adamantium. There is no way a bullet made it inside of my head, much less that it is still there." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "You are wrong about that. A high-caliber bullet was shot through your right eye and actually broke through the back of your eye socket at the weakest point. Once inside your head, it bounced around a few times till your brain was mush, and it rested there as your body healed around it. I am pretty sure just removing the bullet will help with a lot of your memory issues. But we won't know unless we remove it." "How do you even know that is true?" Ezekiel smiled and said, "I would like to say magic, but I found a report on you when it happened. The person who shot you made the report about your death because they thought you died from the bullet to your brain. But you are made of sterner stuff, and it only made you forget most of your life." Logan's hands clenched and his claws popped out as he asked in a growl, "Who was it that shot me? Who was trying to kill me?" "A man named William Stryker, a retired colonel who ran the Weapon Plus program. The same program that made your bones indestructible with adamantium." Logan sat up at that. His breathing was getting a little heavy as he asked, "Where can I find him?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "I currently have no idea, but he is on a short list of people I am looking for." Logan was breathing hard for a few more minutes before he finally let out a deep breath, retracted his claws, and leaned back into the chair. He was quiet for a few minutes before he said, "You can take the bullet out of my head, but only if you let me deal with this striker guy when you find him." Ezekiel smiled as he said, "Deal. So when do you want to remove it from my head, and how are you going to do it?" Ezekiel stood up and said, "I can probably do it now, but you might die when it happens. It will depend on where the bullet is sitting in your brain." "Figures. Well, let's just get it over with then." Ezekiel nodded and said, "Give me a few moments, I need to grab someone, and also grab our mutual friend." A portal appeared next to Ezekiel, and he walked through it without waiting for an answer and left Logan alone. Ezekiel appeared in the hidden base, and a second later, Tao walked through a portal next to him. Ezekiel nodded his head and said, "Thanks for the help." Tao shook her head and said, "I still don't like being used as a portal service. I would have someone else help me, but you are the only person who can make portals in the real world while hiding in the mirror dimension." Ezekiel started to walk out of the room as Tao followed and said, "I still think you showing off my powers like they're yours won't accomplish much. Misdirection is a good skill to use while I am still weak. I want people to think I have more power than I actually do." Tao shook her head and said, "Be glad I currently have nothing else going on." Ezekiel chuckled and said, "You can admit you are having fun also. It won't hurt you." Tao said nothing else as they made their way through the base to Ezekiel's lab. The door was open and many people could be heard talking from inside. As Ezekiel walked into the room, he stopped and looked around for a few moments. There were currently 2 batches of clones in the room, some working together, some rereading books, some of them coding on computers. Ezekiel found who he was looking for and went up to the person and said, "Logan agreed. Do you think you can do it?" The man looked up from the book he was reading and extended his hand out. A small bar of metal began to lift off the table next to him and hovered in the air for a few seconds before it floated back down to the table. Ezekiel smiled wide at that and said, "I still can't believe that works. I have tested it a few times and it still doesn't work for me." The man shrugged his shoulders as he said, "You have my memories and insights into it. I am still not sure why you and the others can't use it." The man set the book he was reading down on the table and grabbed a metal tray from it as he stood up and said, "Let's get this over with. I will despawn in the next few hours. So we might only have one chance at this today, unless you grab Toroi also." "We won't need Toroi. I believe you should be able to handle it." Ezekiel shook his head as he talked. Before he walked out of the room, followed by the man and Tao, they walked to the gym of the base. Steve was alone inside, working a punching bag over. Ezekiel didn't walk in, but said from the door, "Steve, he agreed to meet you. Get cleaned up, and then come meet us on the island. We are heading back there now to try and pull the bullet out of his head." Steve stopped punching the bag as he stepped back from it. He turned around and said, "All right, I will see you in 30 minutes. Good luck on pulling the bullet out." Ezekiel nodded back before he turned around and walked back to the teleportation room. When they reached the room, Tao opened up a portal and Ezekiel and the man walked through it before it closed. Logan had a beer in his hand as he looked up at Ezekiel and the man beside him. He studied the man for a few moments before he said, "Is this the guy who wanted to meet me? He doesn't give off a smell, kinda like you don't either." The man stepped forward and placed a metal tray on the table as he said, "I am not the person who wanted to meet you. I am here to remove the bullet from your head." "All right, Doc. Do whatever you need to and let's get this over with." The man nodded his head and stepped close to Logan as he raised his right hand next to Logan's head. He said, "I can feel 5 bullets and a few other pieces of metal. They are mostly located in the frontal lobe. That would definitely explain the memory issues. Prepare yourself if it doesn't kill you. It will hurt a lot." Before Logan could reply, the man did a few hand signs with his left hand, and then Logan's head was pulled slightly forward. He gnashed his teeth and his claws popped out before his eyes dimmed slightly. Logan's breathing stopped and his body went limp, only being held up by the man's power. After about a minute, blood started to pour out of his nose and Logan's right eye, until the eye popped out of the socket and 5 bullets floated out behind it, along with some tiny pieces of metal carrying some normal bone. Everything floated over and landed in a tray that was sitting on a table next to Logan. Ezekiel looked into the eye socket and could see that the back of the eye socket had 5 circles overlapped in a tight grouping of less than an inch. They were starting to heal as bones slowly regrew to cover the opening. The man turned to Ezekiel and said, "That is everything. Hopefully his memoirs return now." Ezekiel patted the man's shoulder and said, "Thanks for the help, Kazakage." The man nodded in reply and then dispelled into a puff of smoke. Theo was at the park having a picnic with his family when he received the memory packets from the third Kazakage. He was seated next to his father and was currently watching Millie as she reached over for one of the homemade cookies their father had made. When she picked it up, she brought it close to her mouth and held it with both of her hands before she nibbled a small bite from it. When she finished the first bite, she took another small bite and began to chew again as she looked around the park at the other people who were there. Theo started to smile as he watched, and then tapped his father's leg before he pointed at Millie. Theo's dad looked at Millie before he smirked and pulled up the camera he had hanging around his neck and started to take pictures. Theo's mom noticed her husband's actions and looked over at Millie before she started to smile as she watched Millie eat her cookie like a chipmunk. Millie noticed everyone looking at her and stopped chewing. Her head tilted slightly as she said, Her mouth still had some of her cookie in it. Her father reached over and patted her head as he said, "Nothing is wrong. You can finish eating your cookie, chipmunk. We just thought you were being cute." Millie nodded her head as she swallowed her food and then said, "Of course, Millie is always cute. But Millie is Millie, not chipmunk." Theo started to laugh along with his parents before he said, "I think Millie might be getting a big head." Millie used one hand and started to feel her head all around before she puffed out her cheeks and looked at Theo as she said, "Millie's head is fine. It's not getting bigger." Theo laughed a little harder before he said, "Never change, Millie. Why would Millie change? Millie is perfect." Millie stuck her tongue out at Theo before she put her hand back on the cookie and started to eat it again as she looked at her parents who both just smiled at her. 00032. Game night. Ezekiel walked over to the tiki bar and pulled out a washcloth and a bottle of water. He walked back over to Logan and set the bottle and washcloth on the table next to Logan as he sat down on one of the chairs next to him. He left Logan's eye hanging out of the socket because he wanted to see if it would heal by itself or would need to be put back in place to heal properly. A portal opened up a few minutes later as Steve walked through it and looked over at Ezekiel and Logan. His eyes widened slightly as he took in Logan's state and asked, "I know you said he can heal from anything. I remember him getting badly hurt a few times and healing quickly from it, but he looks dead. Are you sure he is going to come back from that?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he pointed to the metal tray and said, "I could see the bone regrowing in his skull about 10 minutes ago. He should be up soon enough." Apparently, the man who shot him unloaded the gun into his head. Steve walked closer and sat down on the chair next to Ezekiel before he said, "I guess we wait then." Ezekiel nodded and started to talk with Steve while they watched Logan for any change. It took another 20 minutes before Logan took in a deep, gasping breath. His claws slowly retracted, and after a minute, he slowly sat up as he looked towards Steve and Ezekiel. He reached up to his right eye and pushed it back into his eye socket as he said, "Who the hell are both of you?" Ezekiel frowned a little and asked, "What is the last thing you remember, Logan?" "Logan? Is that my name? I don't remember anything." Ezekiel looked down for a few moments before he looked remorseful at Logan and said, "I am sorry, Logan. It looks like when the bullets were removed, they ruined your already messed up memories. It was a possibility, but I thought it would only make you lose a handful of memories, not everything you had." Logan chuckled a little and said, "Actually, Ezekiel, the last thing I remember is that guy saying I had 5 bullets in my skull." Ezekiel let out a breath and smiled lightly as he said, "While I appreciate a good joke, maybe not right after we did brain surgery on you." Logan looked at the metal tin with the bullets and bone fragments in it before he looked at the water bottle and washcloth next to it. As Ezekiel said, "Those are so you can clean up. You have blood on your face, chin, and chest." Logan looked down and saw the blood on his chest and shirt. He reached over to the bottle. As he opened the bottle, poured some water on the washcloth, and then proceeded to wipe down his face with it. He said, "That is what you call surgery? I would hate to see what you call first aid." Steve chuckled at that and said, "It's good to see your humor hasn't changed much, James." Logan finished wiping his face down, and as he set the now bloody washcloth down, he said, I am actually surprised to see you alive, Cap, alive, and you look like you haven't aged a day. Both Ezekiel and Steve looked at Logan in shock before Steve asked, You remember me? Logan shook his head and said, Not one bit, but after Ezekiel said my full name. Hank helped me look into it and found out about my military service. Then he found a bunch of pictures of me and you together with some other soldiers. I was hoping to chat with one or two of them, but when we looked all of them up, they were already dead. Steve shook his head and said, Not everyone is dead. You can talk to me and Peggy for now. Bucky is still? Steve, Ezekiel said with a frown. Ezekiel let out a sigh and said, Sorry, but you need to remember he is not part of our group yet. The only reason he is meeting you is because we have this island. Otherwise, you wouldn't meet unless he joins us, or you become public knowledge. Logan raised an eyebrow at that, before he said, He's right. Unless I join you, keep your secrets. Ezekiel looked over at Logan and said, Speaking of secrets, I would appreciate it if you didn't tell anyone who you met today. Xavier will probably help you with your newly healed mind. Let him know to not say anything also. Logan nodded his head before he said, I understand, and also thank the guy who pulled those bullets out of my head. Ezekiel nodded in reply before he stood up and said, Now I will leave you both alone to talk. He looked back at Steve as a portal opened, and as he walked through it he said, Ask Master Kaiselius to send him back when you guys are done. I will be busy. Before Steve could reply, the portal closed behind him and Logan asked, Does he do that often? Steve shook his head and said, No, he just started to do that because of someone else we know. Ezekiel waited a moment as Tao stepped out of a portal next to him before he started to walk towards the door. He opened it up and held it open for Tao before they started walking towards Ezekiel's learning center. It was the room Ezekiel was using for all of his clones. But it also acted as the schoolroom for the kids, and also for the adults who were learning magic. Tao spoke first and asked, So do you think that they will join us? I am not completely sure. Magneto and his people would be the ones I am most worried about. But the others will probably join us. Tao glanced at Ezekiel as they walked and asked, So if Magneto and his Brotherhood don't join, what do you plan to do? Nothing as long as they don't fight against us. But I will remove them if they become an enemy. Tao turned to look at Ezekiel and asked, What about the opinions of me and the others? What if we didn't want to harm them? Ezekiel slowed his pace a little as he looked back at Tao and asked in return, Even if they became our enemy and fought against us at every turn? Yes. Ezekiel smiled and said, I would say you are weak-minded, but if you gave me a better solution to deal with the problem, I would use it. If that still doesn't work, I will handle it my way. From what you told me about yourself, I wouldn't expect you to be so straightforward with your use of violence. Ezekiel nodded slightly as he said, The old me? He wouldn't have even thought about the use of force. But I know the type of universe I am living in and how bad it can be. I plan to survive, to thrive in this new life, and I won't let anyone stand in my way. Talking like that makes me question if I should be working with you or trying to stop you. Ezekiel laughed as he said, I think as long as I have people like you and Steve around me to temper me, I won't turn into a villain. My main purpose is to help people, but I am not naive enough to think I can do it without hurting people. Nothing else was said as they walked to the learning center. When they arrived, Ezekiel went to an empty computer and began to work on his coding project, while most of his other clones were reading college textbooks and a few others were doing experiments in the lab area. Tao walked to the room next door. Inside was everyone who was learning the mystic arts. She smiled a little as she saw her newest and brightest pupil Ava studying. Out of everyone, Ava was the quickest learner and just understood magic almost like it was instinct. Maybe it was because of her accident, or maybe she was just gifted towards the mystic arts like Strange was. She looked at the other people in the room and her eyes rested on Phil. The man was also gifted, not like Ava. But he was well ahead of the others. It was a pity he was busy with his work and couldn't devote himself to studying more. She stepped into the room and said, I am glad everyone is here. It looks like we can start on today's lesson. Ava and Phil, you can continue with your studies for now since you have already completed this. I will work with you both later, going over the next part. I am sorry, Professor, any more power and it could damage Cerebro. Hank let out a sigh as he adjusted the power back down to safe levels and then looked back at Xavier. Xavier smiled slightly as he said, It's fine, Hank. I was just hoping we might have been able to track Logan. We still know next to nothing about Ezekiel, and it's bugging me. Every time it's just another dead end. It's like he is a ghost. He is not a ghost. He is just extremely skilled with covering his tracks. Hank walked over to Xavier and started to push him in his wheelchair out of the room as he asked, "Have you figured out what you plan to do?" "I think I will take whatever offer he gives me, after going over everything with Raven for the past few weeks. I see no other choice than to join him. From what we have seen him do so far, maybe he really can see the future. If even one of those is our real future, I will do anything to stop it from happening." Hank reached over and patted Xavier's shoulder and said, "We are all behind you, Professor. We will trust whatever decision you make." Xavier reached up and rubbed Hank's hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you, Hank. I just wish Eric felt the same way." Hank shook his head and said, "He has always been stubborn and Ezekiel made him look like a fool in their first meeting. Hopefully he will give Ezekiel a chance. At least Eric respects strong people, and even though we know next to nothing about him, he doesn't seem weak at all." Theo was sitting on the floor with his dad next to him. His mother was across from them with Millie. They both had a color board in front of them. Theo's was red and Millie's was blue. Each had little plastic pieces with pictures of cartoon people on it. Millie was looking at her board, while she had her tongue slightly sticking out of her mouth. After a few moments, she asked, "Do they have glasses, Theo?" "No." Millie looked at her mom and smiled, before she started to flip down every person who was wearing glasses. Then she looked up at Theo, who was looking at his board again, before he asked, "Does your person have red hair?" Millie looked at her card, then looked at her mom, who nodded her head. Millie looked back at Theo and said, "Yes." Theo flipped down most of his pieces and was left with 3 people on his board. He looked at Millie, who frowned a little before she turned to her mom with her puppy dog eyes. Her mom smiled and pointed to one of the people and whispered something into Millie's ear. Millie looked at the person she was pointing at and started to nod her head a few times before she smiled and asked, "Does your person have blue eyes, Theo?" "Yes." Millie smiled and knocked down all but 2 pieces. Then she looked at Theo, who was looking at his board again. Theo looked up and watched Millie as he said, "Looks like you could win if I pick wrong. I wonder who it could be, Franz, Alfred, or Bill." As he talked, he watched Millie make a face when he said Alfred. Ezekiel laughed as he said, "You are Franz." Millie stuck out her tongue and said, "Millie is not Franz." She laughed as Ezekiel flipped down one of his pieces before she looked at her mom again. Her mom smiled and pointed to another piece and whispered something in Millie's ear again. Millie nodded before she turned to look at Ezekiel and said, "You are Peter." "You win again, Millie." Ezekiel picked up his card and showed it to Millie and his mom before he set it back into the deck of cards. Millie started to do this weird little wiggle dance as she sat on the floor and said, "Millie won again. Millie is the best at board games." Ezekiel then looked up at his father as Millie was celebrating with her mother and asked, "Can we play Uno now?" His father looked at his mother, who nodded her head and said, "Sure, but you and Millie are a team because she still doesn't understand it correctly." Ezekiel smiled at his mom as he said, "Giving me a handicap? That's fine. We will still win." Millie nodded her head and said, "Theo and Millie will win." Millie was picked up by her mother as she said, "We will see what happens. You can't always be lucky and win every game you play, Millie." She looked at her husband and Theo and said, "Since Millie was the winner, she is going to help me in the kitchen and pick out our snacks. Millie wants cookies." As Theo's mother carried Millie into the kitchen, his dad patted his shoulder and asked, "You totally let her win. She has no poker face at all." Theo smiled and looked up at his dad as he said, "It's just a game, and she gets really happy anytime she wins. But you let her win every game you guys played today." Ezekiel was packing up the current game as he said, "For now, once she is older, I won't go so easy on her. I will only let her win 60% of the games." Theo's dad shook his head as he rubbed Theo's hair and said, "You spoil her too much. You know that, right?" "Yeah, but seeing her happy makes me happy. Plus, isn't that what older brothers are supposed to do? Make sure their little sisters are happy." 00033 History Lesson. Ezekiel was seated on top of some water in the little pond he made last time he visited here. His eyes were closed, and he was trying to sense the universal energy around him, with little luck so far. He was training his chakra control and training his sensor ability to look for universal energy. His concentration was broken when someone came into range of his ability. He smirked a little as he realized who it was, before he cooled his expression. A few moments later, he could hear leaves rustling, then the soft sound of boots touching the soft dirt. I didn't think you would show up, let alone show up almost an hour early. I wanted to talk before Charles arrived. Ezekiel stood up from the water and opened his eyes to look at Magneto as he asked, "What do you wish to discuss?" Magneto's hands clenched slightly before he relaxed them and asked, "How much of what you showed Raven was really the future?" "In theory, all of them are the future. But which will happen to us?" "None of them if I have my way." Magneto frowned as he asked, "So it only gets better for mutants when you are the one leading us?" Ezekiel smiled as he shook his head and said, "No, it gets better for everyone." Magneto began to shake a little as his hands clenched and he spit out, "You wish to help humans? The same ones who hate us? Who fear us? Who attack us?" The ground around Ezekiel and Magneto was beginning to shake and Magneto's voice was rising as he said, "The same ones who kill us? Who kidnap and experiment on us? Why? Because we are different from them? You really wish to help those people? Those types of people? No, I don't plan to help them. But normal people who haven't done anything? I will gladly help them." The ground was still shaking as Magneto said in a low tone filled with enmity, "All humans are the same." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "Just because you have powers doesn't mean you are no longer human." Spikes of metal shot up out of the ground all around the clearing and forest in a circle with Magneto as the center, who snarled out, "I am not a human. I am a mutant. Homo superior. Look around you. This is the difference between mutants and humans." Ezekiel smiled and asked, "If you are no longer human and the same goes for other mutants, then what about your parents? They weren't mutants, were they?" Magneto was quiet for a moment before he said in a more normal tone of voice, "No, but I was one of the first who was blessed to become Homo superior." Ezekiel started to laugh. Magneto began to frown again. Before he could say anything, Ezekiel raised a hand up to stop him as he tried to stop laughing. When he stopped, he smirked and said, "You have no idea how ignorant that statement is. It just shows how much you don't know about the world and universe in general. You aren't even close to being one of the first mutants in the universe, let alone on Earth. The first mutant was made about 1,000,000 years ago. Yes, I said made. That Homo superior gene you are so proud of having, it was made and implanted into humans as an experiment. The first real Homo superior was born on Earth sometime around 15,000 BC, and in case you were wondering, she is still alive." Magneto's frown dropped, and he studied Ezekiel for a while before he asked, "How do you know any of this?" "It's not hard when you can see the past and the future. And before you ask, the beings who created the mutant gene were so powerful that you, with all of your power, would look like an ant to them." Magneto looked a little lost as he thought about what Ezekiel had just told him. Ezekiel spoke up and said, "How about once Xavier and his group arrive? I will show all of you some proof of what I am talking about." Magneto didn't speak, but nodded his head in reply as he stood there, looking at nothing in particular. It was a somewhat awkward silence as they waited for the others. Ezekiel went back to practicing his skills, while Magneto just stood there quietly thinking about what Ezekiel just told him. After half an hour, Ezekiel sensed a few people approaching and stood up as he said, "Xavier is here." Magneto looked up to the sky. A minute later, Xavier, Storm, Logan, and Mystique came into view and then landed close to Magneto. They looked around at the metal spikes before Logan asked, "What happened? Magneto tried to fight you again?" "No, more like he threw a tantrum." Storm smirked slightly as Logan laughed, while Xavier and Mystique looked at Magneto in worry. Magneto made no real reaction besides turning to face Ezekiel. Logan stopped his laughter as he and everyone else looked at Magneto. Xavier studied his friend for a moment before he asked in concern, "What did you do to him?" "I believe he is in shock after I destroyed his worldview." Everyone looked from Magneto to Ezekiel, who smiled and said, "Time for a quick history lesson." As he was speaking, he was doing hand signs behind his back with one hand. The next moment, everyone was seated in an amphitheater with Ezekiel standing on the stage. Behind him was a projection screen. Displayed on the screen was a chibi Ezekiel, and next to that was a title, "What are mutants?" Ezekiel looked at everyone and said, "Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. My name is Ezekiel." That's not right. "Welcome to my history lesson on who made mutants." Yeah, that sounds better. Everyone was kinda looking around in slight shock for a moment before they focused on Ezekiel, who was walking to one side of the stage. He stopped once he was there and looked at his audience before he said, "So about 1,000,000 years ago, a group of godlike cosmic beings called the Celestials visited Earth. Their goal was to experiment on and judge lower life forms. They created two life forms, the Eternals and the Deviants, from selected species and inserted a latent gene into baseline humanity that causes mutations. The thing you all call the X gene." A video was playing on the screen as Ezekiel talked. It was showing everything Ezekiel talked about. It even showed each of the Eternals who were created and pictures of them on Earth. As it showed more modern-day pictures of each Eternal, it stopped on the last picture of Kingo as Ezekiel said, "That is Sri Kingo, one of the Eternals and a Bollywood star. If you trace back his family in the movies, you will notice he looks strangely similar to his great-great-grandfather, great-grandfather, grandfather, and father." As he talked, images came up of each person before they overlapped, and they were all almost a perfect copy of the same person. Ezekiel smiled and asked, "Any questions so far?" Magneto spoke up and asked, "So we could go find these people and confirm everything you were saying?" Ezekiel nodded as he smirked, before he said, "Yes, you could do that. But I should warn you that each one of them is stronger than you and don't like it when people come around asking about stuff they shouldn't know. That being said, feel free to try. I would love to see how well that works out for you." Magneto frowned slightly but said nothing else. Ezekiel looked up at the screen and the images changed to a stunning-looking woman with pale white skin, raven black hair, and icy blue eyes. She was wearing very trendy-looking clothing and was seated in a cafe with the Eiffel Tower in the background behind her. Selene Gallio, the first true-born mutant of Earth. She is about 17,000 years old and is extremely dangerous. Her main mutant power is life force absorption through touch, kinda like a vampire but without the teeth. She can use that life force to power herself in other ways: super strength, speed, endurance, reflexes. She is also a high-order telepath, a telekinetic, and has pyrokinesis. Oh, she is also a master of the mystic arts and immortal. I am mostly telling you this so in case you find yourself meeting her, you know to be cautious and leave as quickly as possible. Mystique spoke up and asked, "Mystic arts? You mean like magic?" "Magic isn't real." "Right. Magic is very real. I work with the current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. I will introduce you to them if you join us." Everyone was quiet for a moment before Xavier spoke up and asked, "You said she is like a vampire. You don't mean to imply vampires are real, correct?" Ezekiel chuckled and said, "Vampires are very real and can be very dangerous to normal humans and even less powerful metahumans." Xavier spoke up again and asked, "Metahumans as in mutants?" "Yes, but also others, like me. I am a metahuman, a powered individual who doesn't have an X gene. There are also the Eternals, Inhumans, powered people like me, half-breeds with aliens, people who were experimented on. All of those people and us fall under the term metahuman, plus it sounds so much better than mutant. Mutant just sounds bad when you say it. I am pretty sure whoever coined the term designed it that way." Magneto was the next to speak and said, "So you plan to work with all of these metahumans?" Ezekiel nodded and said, "I am already working with some people. Some are metahumans, others are just normal humans. But we are all working together to make the world a better place. Which is why I want to invite you both to join us." Xavier and Magneto shared a look for a few moments, before they looked at Ezekiel again and Xavier said, "We would like to join you." Magneto nodded yes as Xavier spoke. Ezekiel smiled at that and said, "Great, I was hoping you would both join us. But keep in mind, while you joined us, the main group is going to remain a secret from all of you. I will introduce you to a few select people and share resources with you. But the main group and our base of operations will stay hidden for now for security reasons." Magneto nodded his head as he said, "Understandable. Trust is earned, not given." Ezekiel smiled and said, "Exactly, now first order of business. I have been searching for a hidden facility owned by a certain group. They are technically the same ones who injected Logan's skeleton with metal. They have also been kidnapping metahumans and doing experiments on them. Logan snarled out, "Stryker?" Ezekiel smiled as some files popped up on the screen that had top-secret info about the Weapon X project and Logan. A picture of Logan with some weird-looking gear on popped up, and next to him was standing a man in an army military uniform. Ezekiel looked directly at Logan and said, "If we are lucky, we will find him at the facility I am looking for." Theo was sitting at the computer in a booster seat. His parents had finally allowed him to use it under supervision. His father was sitting next to him and looking at the book Theo had memorized from the library. They checked it back out so he could understand what Theo was typing on the computer. But he didn't really understand it and asked, "So what does this stuff you are typing there mean?" His father pointed at a piece of code as he asked. Theo let out a sigh and said, "It's an if statement, Dad. It's on page 184. The third paragraph explains about it." "Yeah, but I asked you what it means." Theo stopped typing and looked at his dad as he said, "You know, if you just let me type, I could show you when it's all done. But if you must know, an if statement is a true or false question. They ask the program if something is true and tell it what to do next based on the answer." Theo's dad rubbed his head with one hand and said, "That wasn't that hard now, was it?" Theo frowned a little at his father as he said, All right, I won't bug you anymore. I will just watch." "You said that when I started." Theo's dad smiled and said, "But it's boring just watching you type." Theo turned back around and started to type again as he said, "I told you and Mom it was going to be boring, but you said I needed to be supervised. Maybe read something, since you aren't really reading the coding book. The book is boring also. It might be more boring than watching you type." "Not my problem, Dad." His dad looked over to his wife who was playing with Millie and asked, "Want to trade?" His wife just shook her head no before she said, "You were the one who insisted he should be supervised. I said we could just check on him every once in a while. It's not like we can't look over and see him." "But it's so boring." His wife shook her head and said, "Today you get to supervise him like you wanted. Tomorrow maybe we will change the policy." She looked down at Millie and asked, "Isn't that right, Millie?" Millie nodded her head as she said, "Daddy said he would watch Teo today, so Daddy needs to watch Teo." Theo's dad let out a sigh and asked, "Millie, sweetie, can Daddy join you and Mommy? Please." Millie shook her head and said, "No, Daddy needs to watch Teo." Theo's dad smiled as he said, "Millie, sweetie, you know Daddy is the one who makes cookies, right?" Millie's head snapped to look at her father and asked, "Daddy will make cookies?" Theo's dad smiled a little wider and said, "I could make cookies." He let out a sigh, "But I have to stay here and watch Theo." Millie shook her head and said, "No, Daddy can go make cookies. Mommy will watch Teo." Theo's dad smirked as he said, "Hear that, honey? You need to watch Theo, and I will go make some cookies." Theo's mom shook her head and smiled as she said, "No, you can stay there. I will make cookies with Millie." "Come on, Millie. Mama's gonna make peanut butter cookies." Millie's head snapped to look at her mother as she asked, "Mama can make cookies too?" 00034. First one found. Bringing everyone out of the Jinjutsu, Ezekiel smiled as he said, "All right, now that we are all on the same page, I will introduce you to the current Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. She is called the Ancient One and I would treat her with respect. She is a lot older than all of you combined and can easily crush you in a fight." Ezekiel turned to Xavier and said, "I know you reading someone's mind is pretty much an automatic response, but control yourself. While you might be able to enter her mind, you might not come back out unless she lets you. So please behave yourself." Xavier nodded in reply before Ezekiel said, "You can come out wherever you like." The air shimmered next to Ezekiel before it cracked and a bald woman in yellow robes appeared next to him. She gave a non-threatening smile and said, "I am the Ancient One, Sorcerer Supreme of Earth. It is a pleasure to meet you all." She bowed slightly to everyone before she looked at Xavier and said, "You lack control. I can feel your mind reaching out to mine even as you force it not to." After coming to an agreement with Xavier and Magneto, the next 6 months flew by for Theo. Theo turned 3 along with Peter, MJ, and Jean, while Millie turned 2. During that time, Theo and his clones had finished his social media platform and stealth launched all the starter platforms of it. It hadn't blown up yet, but it had over 300,000 registered users and was starting to pick up steam. Theo had targeted college and university students the most, but other people were starting to take notice and join. The video platform was the second most used with over 100,000 users. There were already a few people that seemed to be focusing on creating and uploading content. The image hosting platform was the least used out of everything that was created. But it was expected since almost no smartphones currently had cameras that were reasonably priced for the average consumer. There were a few photographers who were using it to display their work, but the platform currently only had a few thousand members. As for the yet-to-be-named group Theo had brought together, besides recruitment, which was slow-going, it was mostly training, gathering intelligence, and searching for hidden bases. We had found a few, but we didn't want to make a move unless we had enough people for the fallout if things went sideways. That and the only two bases that were priority targets were Bucky's and the Weapon X facility. As for the intelligence gathering, with the new software that Theo had made for Shield phones, that went better than expected. They adopted it after a week. The encryption is considered a work of genius, and Sam was promoted for it. He has some extra responsibilities now, but one of Theo's clones takes care of all the work. Another thing Theo had been doing was buying up property in the New York area, mostly around where Stark would build his tower, but he was also buying a large area in Brooklyn. He had plans to make a headquarters for his social media platform. He planned to make some really interesting buildings with small businesses on the ground floor, the office space for workers above that. Then after the 15th floor, it would all be housing. He wanted to buy a few city blocks and then make a private park for the buildings between them all. As for Theo's personal life with his family, besides the birthdays, Theo had finished the alpha of his game, with help from Peter. Peter read the programming book with help from Theo and wanted to help, so it turned into a joint project with input from Millie, who didn't want to be left out. It was basic and the graphics weren't great, and everything was made of blocks, but his little sister loved to play it. Even his parents enjoyed it. They mostly watched Millie, Peter, or Theo playtest it for bugs. But Theo's Blockcraft was looking to be a hit. Peter's parents were completely surprised when they heard that Theo had made a video game. "Wait, you aren't being serious right now, are you?" Jacob smirked at one of the men he considered a brother and said, "If you weren't so busy working all the time, both of you would have heard about it a few months ago." Richard shook his head and said, "Me and Mary have deadlines we need to meet, and the project was a lot harder than we expected. We had a lucky break, though, so we are taking a month off to spend more time with Peter." Jacob reached out and patted Richard's shoulder as he said, "Good. Even though Ben and May treat him like their own, he still needs his real parents too." Richard nodded before he asked again, "You really aren't joking around about this? Theo is the one who programmed that game?" Jacob nodded, the smirk on his face full of pride as he said, "He found a how-to-code book at the library and wanted to read it. When he proved to us that he memorized the whole book in a few days, we decided to let him make something. This is what he came up with. He also had Peter and Millie help him. But he is barely 3 years old to be able to memorize that book. To even program something like that, he might just be the next Tony Stark or Reed Richards." Jacob smirked again and said, "He's not the only one." Richard looked at Jacob in surprise as he asked, "Millie is just as gifted?" Jacob chuckled before he said, "While Millie is very smart for her age, Peter might be as smart as Theo." Peter was so enthralled by the concept that Theo was making a video game, he started reading the same programming book. He might have been slower, but now he and Theo brainstorm ideas on how to add things to the game. Theo said Peter helped him come up with about 20% of the current game code. Richard looked in shock at his son, who was sitting next to Millie and Theo. They were currently letting Millie play the game, and whenever an error came up, they would save the error log file, then reload the game from the last save file, and let her continue to play as they talked excitedly about what they should add to the game next. Before they could come to a decision, Richard had come over and picked up Peter as he asked, "You learned how to program?" Peter smiled proudly at his father and said, "Big brother Theo taught me." Richard hugged his son tightly for a moment and said, "Let's go tell you mother how smart you are." Peter's face lit up before he frowned a little and said, "But me and Theo are still working." Richard's face fell a little as Jacob laughed before he said, "Doesn't feel that great when it's used on you?" Richard nodded his head mutely before Theo spoke up and said, "We can take a break for now. It will take us a while to figure out how to program the stuff we already came up with." Peter nodded along to what Theo said before he smiled and told his dad, "Let's go see mother." Richard smiled and walked out of the living room into the kitchen holding Peter. As they walked into the room, Richard could be heard saying, "Mary, guess who is a little genius?" Jacob smiled down at Theo and Millie as he said, "I still can't believe you guys made this. It wasn't hard after you read that book." Jacob smirked at his son as he said, "I tried, but I couldn't understand that book at all. Give me an engine to fully rebuild over that stuff any day of the week." Theo smiled up at his dad as Mary walked in from the kitchen holding Peter in her arms and said, "Let's see this little game you are making with Theo." Mary walked over next to Jacob and said, "Richard said the kids were making a new game, but didn't want to tell me about it. He said I needed to see it for myself. Where is it at?" Jacob smirked and said, "Millie is currently playing it." Mary looked at the computer screen for a few moments before she started to laugh lightly. She looked back at Jacob and said, "I know the kids are smart, but this joke is a bit much." "It's not a joke, Aunt Mary. We made this game ourselves." Mary chuckled again as she set Peter down in the chair next to Theo. She ruffled Theo's hair as she said, "If you guys made this, then prove it." Theo smirked as he told Millie, "Millie, save the game, and then try to pick up a bucket of water again." "Okay, Theo." Millie walked over to some water, opened up her inventory, and pulled out a bucket. She then saved the game before she tried to pick up a bucket of water. The game crashed and an error log file came up. Millie turned to look at Theo and asked, "Now what do I do?" "Let Peter have your seat. He is going to fix it." Millie nodded and got out of her seat as Peter said, "I don't know if I can fix it, Theo." Theo smiled as he patted Peter's shoulder and said, "You will be fine. The log file is right there. Just read what it says, and you will figure it out." Peter still wasn't sure, but switched places with Millie. Mary watched quietly as Peter studied the log file for a while, before he opened up a program and lines of code could be seen. He hit Control F, then typed in a few things before he started looking through the results. After a while, he stopped and looked at the code in front of him for a bit. He pulled up the log file again and compared it to the code. After a few minutes, he started to change the code. Everyone was quiet as they watched. Theo had a brilliant smile as he knew Peter had figured out the proper way to fix the issue. It took a few minutes, but Peter finished typing, saved his work as a new copy, then closed everything and restarted the game and loaded the save game. He clicked the water with the bucket and it was filled. No error came up this time. Peter turned around with the biggest smile on his face and said, "I did it by myself?" Theo smiled back and was about to speak when Mary said, Yes, you did, sweetie. That was incredible." Peter was practically glowing from his mother's praise as she asked, "How come no one told us about this?" May, who had walked into the room at some point, said, "I did tell you, a few times. If I remember correctly, you said, 'Oh, that's wonderful. I am glad he is having fun,' or something like that." Mary actually looked embarrassed before she said, "Sorry." Peter was still smiling, but it wasn't as bright as before. May gently pushed Mary towards Peter as she said, "Peter has really missed you guys. How about you go out and do something as a family?" Mary nodded her head as she picked up Peter and asked, "What can Mama do to make it up to you, honey?" Peter thought about it for a while before he said, "Can we go to Coney Island?" "Coney Island? Sure, we can go there." Peter looked at Theo and Millie before he asked, "Can Theo and Millie come with us?" "Sure, we can take everyone and make it a family trip. If they want to join us, that is." May said, "Sounds like a good idea to me. What about you, Jacob?" Jacob nodded his head in reply. Millie looked at her dad and asked, "What is Coney Island?" Jacob picked up Millie and said, "It's a fun place that has games and rides. I don't think you can do many of the rides, but they have cotton candy." "Candy?" Millie likes candy. Fury, Peggy, Steve, Hank, Carlson, Hill, and Tao were seated in a briefing room with Ezekiel, who called them for an emergency meeting. On the wall monitor, another group of people were gathered together. Magneto, Xavier, Mystique, Logan, Storm, and Beast were also called to join the meeting. For Magneto and the others, they only saw Ezekiel, and the other people beside Tao were all blurred out. They had been a little upset with not knowing who they were working with at first, but had gotten used to it after Ezekiel said they needed to earn the others' trust first before they would share their identity. Fury was the first to speak once everyone was seated and said, "I was in the middle of handling a very important issue. This better be good." Magneto looked like he was about to speak when Ezekiel said, Hope you haven't had lunch yet. The screens for both groups changed and displayed what first looked like a small banquet room that was covered in red paint. On closer look, you could see parts of chopped-up bodies all over the room. The picture changed and showed the room from different angles. Each time you could notice little things that you couldn't see the first time. Fury stood up as he shouted, "Those are classified." Fury's outburst was actually beeped out for the other group, but they did see the person stand up and say something. Ezekiel had a program to bleep out anything that might give away who Fury and the others are. It would also change their voices and blur out what they looked like. Ezekiel smiled at Fury and said, "They might be, but they are why I called you here." Ezekiel looked at the screen and said, "I finally found one of our targets." Steve spoke up and asked, "Did Bucky do that?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, this was done by a young girl." Fury slightly glared at Ezekiel as he pointed at the screen and asked, "How do you know a kid did that?" "I was able to find some images before and after she left the room." Fury slammed a hand down on the table as he said, "Did you erase all of the camera footage from around the area?" "No, someone else did that, and they did a great job of covering their tracks. But I was able to recover the data." Fury shook his head as he sat back down and said, "I wish you would share that tech with us. You know exactly why I haven't shared it yet." Fury didn't reply, but Xavier spoke up and asked, "So why is this important to us?" The screen changed and it showed a young girl about 12 years old going into a room. After a while, that same girl came out of the room, soaked head to toe in blood and gore. Ezekiel pulled up a good picture of the girl and said, "Meet X-23. She is a clone of Logan and we are going to rescue her, her mother, and anyone else we find. When we raid the base she is being kept at 00035. Setting up the plan of attack. And why do we need to rescue the little murder machine?" Ezekiel looked at Hill and said, "Because that isn't her choice. The group who made her are trying to make the perfect weapon. Plus, she is technically Logan's daughter. That reason is good enough to help her out." Logan spoke up finally and growled out, "How were they able to clone me? Leftover material from when you were part of the Weapon X program." Even though the government shut down the program, the main scientist and Stryker decided to start again with a new project. "I still haven't figured out who is backing them, but hopefully when we raid the facility we will find out." Coulson spoke next and asked, "It seems like you already have some info on them. How come you haven't gained access to their servers yet? Is their security that good?" "The facility is not connected to any outside network as far as I could tell. The only reason I have any info at all is because of this attack. I was able to dig a few things up, including where the facility is located." Steve spoke up next and asked, "So what is your plan?" Ezekiel laughed before he said, "I don't really have one. I have some ideas, but I have never attempted to raid a heavily guarded facility before. So I was hoping someone with more experience could help out." Fury looked at Peggy and Steve for a moment. Peggy glanced back at Fury before she nodded slightly. Fury turned to look at Ezekiel and said, "We first need any intelligence you have on the base." The screen changed to a satellite picture of the outside of the base. It only showed the small portion that was not underground. Ezekiel pointed at it and said, "That is all I have, besides the location. I have searched through everything I could. That base does not exist anywhere digitally. I was only able to find the base because I followed the vehicles they used with my satellite network." Fury let out a sigh as he said, "That is very little to go on. We really need to get some intel on the inside of that base. Layout, number of hostiles, hostages, if there are any special targets we need to be aware of. I had an idea on how to get all of that, but Tao, or one of the other sorcerers, will have to help us." Tao looked at Ezekiel and asked, "You want to scout the place from the mirror dimension?" Ezekiel smiled. As Fury looked at Tao in surprise as he asked, "Would that work?" Tao nodded her head as she said, "Scouting the whole base from the mirror dimension would be easy. We could even pull people into the mirror dimension and neutralize them there when we attack. I would suggest asking Master Kaiselius and Mordo to help you." Fury nodded his head as he looked back at Ezekiel and asked, "What other ideas do you have?" "I would suggest that we connect one of my compact flash drives to their internal network as soon as possible. I can take over their whole system from there, and we will have all the info we need. Amount of personnel, shifts, guard patrols, and anything else we would need to form a plan of attack." Hank spoke up next and asked, "Wouldn't that alert them?" I am sure they have to have pretty complex cybersecurity in place. Ezekiel smiled as he said, I doubt that will be an issue once the compact flash drive is inserted into the computer. The computer detecting what the drive is will run the program and not notice anything wrong. Even if they have all the computer's external ports disconnected, it will still work. Since no one disables the physical connection, only the software driver for them. Fury thought about it for a little while before he said, Fine, let's get your drive connected and scout the base out. He turned to Steve and asked, Feel like stretching your legs and putting your skills to work, Captain? Steve smiled as he said, I could use the exercise. Fury turned to Ezekiel and asked, How long will it take you to make the device? I already have a few of them built and ready to use. Ezekiel looked at Tao and asked, I will dispel myself to send Ezekiel the information. Can you please go to him? He will need to send a new clone over. Tao nodded her head, and as she stood up, she started to form a portal. Before the portal fully opened, Ezekiel turned into a smoke cloud and disappeared. Fury looked at Coulson and said, Can you go grab Master Kaecilius and Mordo? Steve was looking around the area as he clenched and unclenched his fists. Next to him, Kaecilius was also trying hard to control his emotions, but Steve could tell his breathing had sped up. They were currently in the mirror dimension, scouting the base Ezekiel had found. After installing Ezekiel's drive into one of the ports in the server room, they left him there as they went to check out the rest of the base. The base was in the middle of nowhere and a 3-hour drive through back roads in the mountains from the closest paved road. The outside of the base was hidden in a cliff face, and almost no one would realize it was there even if they looked for it. Most of it was normal on the first floor, hidden behind the cliff face door. Mostly rooms for the staff to use, a small armory, break room, gym, kitchen, dining hall, barracks, offices, restrooms, stuff you would expect for most military bases. The second and first floor was only connected with a single set of extra-wide stairs that had a ramp on one side. The second floor was more of the same as the first except for more guards, a security room, a bigger armory, and a very secure vault-type door. Behind that door was a freight elevator that went 30 stories underground. It was the only stop and technically the third floor, which split into 3 directions. They went to the left first and found operating rooms, offices, restrooms, and a secure vault-type door. Behind that door was living quarters for what looked like the scientist staff. It also held the central server and the power plant for the base. After leaving Ezekiel in the server room, Kaecilius and Steve went to the right side hallway. The hall went straight for a little while before it turned right, and they ran into another secure vault-type door. Past that door was what could only be described as a prison block, row after row of prison cells. Only 3 cells were currently in use. One had the girl they were here to help. In another one was a woman who looked like she could be the older sister of the young girl. In the last cell was a sealed container that looked to be filled with metal. Past all of the cells was a gym/dojo area with a woman in it who was currently doing weight training. They left that area and moved to the last hallway that went straight from the elevator. It went down the hallway, which took a right turn and had another secure vault-type door. Going inside, they found a big open area that had highly advanced equipment and over 100 big tubes filled with half-grown bodies of the girl they were planning to rescue. They had slowly examined the room before they came to the other side of it, where another vault door was. Going through that, they found a hallway with more operation rooms which were temperature-controlled. These rooms each had a body strapped down to the table, and each body was in different stages of being dissected. All of the people on the tables looked like mutants. Most were adults or teens, and a few were even children. While Kaecilius and Steve were shocked and outraged at what they had found, it was the next vault door they went through that caused both of them to feel anger. It was the morgue for the facility, and it was massive. It had to be bigger than 3 football fields in length and wider than 2 of them combined. Steve couldn't even see the back wall of the room in the dim lights of the room. Row after row of racks that went to the ceiling stretched from where they were standing. The first few racks they could see were completely filled with bodies, and as they walked they just found more full racks. They walked through over 3/4 of the room before they found a rack that wasn't full. But it didn't improve their mood any. The tag on the side of the rack read 22,000 and 1 to 23,000. Kaecilius finally spoke. His voice had an edge to it as he asked, "What kind of monsters could do this?" Not really expecting an answer to his question. Steve had a frown as he said, "This place reminds me of the camps." Caecilius glanced at Steve as he asked, "What camps?" Steve let out a sigh before he said, "The ones the Nazis made. I helped to free a few of them during the war. This place reminds me of them. The disregard for human life. The operating rooms used for experimenting on people. The Nazis didn't make a massive morgue, though. They had used ovens or mass graves." Caecilius nodded his head before he said, "I forgot you are older than you look." Steve turned around as he said, "Let's get out of here and go grab Ezekiel. I have seen more than enough of this place." It was less than 6 hours later that everyone was back in the meeting room to go over the findings from Steve, Caecilius, and Ezekiel's scouting trip. Caecilius had joined in on this meeting along with Mordo, Xavier, and his group had joined in again remotely. Steve and Caecilius had been quiet since they came back and had said nothing along with Ezekiel. Fury was the first to speak once the other group joined them and asked, "So what did you find?" "A den of monsters." Fury looked at Caecilius before he could ask what he meant. Ezekiel spoke up and said, "I couldn't have said it better. The sooner we attack them, the better." The screen changed as plans for the base layout came up before it started to fill up with dots. Almost all of them were red. Only 3 dots were green, and they were in the bottom of the base in the right hallway cell block. Some of the dots were moving around, others were stationary. Ezekiel looked at Fury and said, "That is everyone currently in the base." He looked at the monitor and said to Logan, "Stryker is currently not in the base and neither is the lead researcher. But everyone else that matters is there." Logan didn't respond, but Magneto asked, "What did you find there?" The screen changed and it showed a video feed of the morgue. It was kinda hard to make out, but the camera zoomed in to show some of the bodies on one of the racks. Ezekiel spoke after a few moments and said, "We found a den of monsters. Almost 23,000 people dissected and saved in a morgue to be used for tissue samples for cloning or experiments." "They killed almost 23,000 people?" Ezekiel looked at Peggy and shook his head as he said, "They only kept the people with mutations. The other people they incinerated." Steve's voice was low as he asked, "How many more people did they kill?" The screen changed and showed a database of names. The list scrolled to the bottom quickly and the last entry was coded, "Case file. #134, 563 Cecily Kincaid." Above that name were 2 other entries, "Case file. #134, 562 Jill Kincaid," and "Case file. #134, 561 Mark Kincaid." As everyone looked at the list, they noticed a pattern. It would almost always have more than one entry with the same last name. Ezekiel let out a sigh as he said, when they found a target, they would also grab any close family to the target. Any they found without the X gene were killed outright. The others were injected with a special drug to force the gene to activate, then they were killed and dissected. Those were the lucky ones. The people who had powers that weren't considered dangerous were dissected while they were still alive. Over 130,000 people were killed by them. Magneto spoke up, his voice barely held in check as he asked, "When do we attack them?" Ezekiel glanced at Magneto before he looked to Fury and said, "Stryker is currently out with a capture team bringing back a new specimen. The lead, Dr. Martin Sutter, is currently meeting with the project's backers and should be back in a few days. I would suggest that we wait for both of them to come back and then attack." Fury thought for a few moments before he asked, "Who are the project backers?" "People we are already targeting." Steve clenched his fist as he let out, "Hydra." Xavier and the others didn't hear Steve, but did hear Ezekiel as he replied, "Exactly." Jacob laughed as he asked, "You can't be serious?" Richard shook his head and said, "No, we both quit. We are going to move in with Ben in May after we sell our condo in the city, while we look for a house in this neighborhood." "But you had the perfect jobs. You said it was your dream job, working on cutting-edge science with your wife." Richard put his arm around Jacob's shoulder as he said, "It was, but we pretty much missed the first 3 years of Peter's life. Me and Mary talked over our vacation and decided we didn't want to miss any more of Peter's life. Once we sell our condo, we will have more than enough money to buy a house around here and set up a decent lab for us in the basement. We could then work from home on projects while we also spend a lot more time with Peter." Jacob shook his head but then smiled and said, "I used to think you were the smartest guy I ever met. Then you go and do something like this and prove it." They both laughed before Jacob said, "You know, if you want a place to work from, Ben and I have the lower basement of the garage. We could clear out half of it and have it remodeled for you to use as your new lab. It would be a lot more space than a house basement, and you would save money for more equipment for your lab." Richard was a little shocked as he looked at Jacob before he asked, "You would do that for us?" "Of course I would. You are family." 00036. Your quest is to... Sarah Kinney was released from her prison cell earlier that day. She had secretly taken Laura out of the base to help her sister and niece Megan, who had been kidnapped. While they were successful and rescued her niece, it wasn't something her boss was happy with, and as punishment she was placed in a cell for the past month. She wasn't allowed to do anything, not even work, while she was on unpaid leave, as her boss called it. She was released in the morning, and the first thing she wanted to do was see Laura. It had been a month, and she wanted to make sure she was doing okay. It was the longest they had ever been apart since Laura was born. Once she was released, she wasn't allowed to see Laura immediately. Laura had training to do. Sarah could only shake her head when she heard that. The training, as they called it, was more like torture, with that psycho bitch Kimura in charge of it. So she went to her office and began to check all of the emails she had missed for the past month. She was upset when she read a report that Laura had been sent out on a mission. When she started working for the facility, she didn't know what they truly wanted to do. She just knew they were at the cutting edge in her field of study, and everything else was top secret after that. They kept a lot of what they did a secret after she joined and only allowed her access to certain areas. She worked for years ignorant of what they were really doing. She had kept her head down and focused only on her work. Even after she had proved cloning the sample she was working with could be viable if made as female, she was still kept locked out from learning most of the stuff the facility worked on. It was years later, after she had been forced to be the surrogate mother for the clone, no, for her daughter Laura. That was when she was finally pulled into the true fold of what the facility was doing. She wanted to prove she could be more useful with her new security access, so she went back to look at everything she could get her hands on. It was a mistake. The first file she opened horrified her. A family was captured and brought in because their child was a mutant. The things they did to that family, she didn't sleep correctly for weeks. They were monsters. Sarah knew she couldn't stay there for long. But at that point, Laura was already a major part of her life. Even though they didn't interact as much as she would have liked, Sarah considered Laura her daughter. She couldn't leave her daughter with these people, but currently she wasn't sure how she could escape with Laura and keep her safe. Ezekiel had his program watching the facility, waiting for Stryker and Sutter to return. While the group was waiting for that to happen, Fury had chosen the team for capturing the base. It was going to be Ezekiel, Magneto, Logan, Xavier, and Kaecilius. Ezekiel would handle the computer system. Kaecilius would pull people into the mirror dimension for Magneto to capture. Xavier would be used to knock them unconscious, and Logan would be used to dispose of the trash once they were finished. Ezekiel did bring up a point of contention among the group. He wanted to keep the facility. Fury also thought it would be a good idea to keep it. Everyone else wanted to destroy it and everything inside it. "I'm sorry, did you say you want to keep the lower portion of the base?" Ezekiel turned to look at Coulson as he said, "Yes, I need the tools they have, and since it's already set up and working, why should we waste it?" Magneto spoke up from the monitor and said, "After everything you have shown us about the place, I think it's best if it was destroyed." Xavier nodded his head as he said, "I have to agree with Eric on this. Once we complete the mission, we should dispose of that base and everything in it. Experiments like that shouldn't be allowed to continue." Hank Pym spoke next as he said, "I also agree, but we should save some of the technology to study it. Some of that stuff is cutting edge and probably one of a kind. It would be a massive waste to destroy equipment like that." Fury shook his head as he said, "I can't believe I am saying this, but I agree with Ezekiel on this. Not only could we use it as another hidden base, but we could probably put that cloning tech to work for us, which is exactly why we should destroy it once we are done." Ezekiel looked towards the monitor at Magneto, who just spoke, and said, "But that is exactly why I want it. I have plans to make clones. That is one of the reasons I was targeting this place. I knew they had the most advanced cloning tech, and I don't plan to let it go to waste." The room went quiet as everyone looked at Ezekiel. He looked at everyone before he let out a sigh and said, "Don't look at me like that. I might want to make clones, but it's not for the reason most of you would think. My current clones aren't that useful in a fight, but what if I could make real clones who could fight and still use my powers?" Most of the people realized what Ezekiel was talking about and wanted to do. Xavier and his people were a little confused but said nothing. It was Steve who spoke next and asked, "Is that all you want to use the equipment for? To clone bodies for yourself?" Ezekiel nodded and said, "Pretty much. I have a few other experiments I want to try that aren't related to cloning. But I could do that without the tech in that base. It would just take me a little longer." Fury spoke next as he looked at Ezekiel and asked, "So you want the base all to yourself till you are finished?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, it would be a shared resource. But I would be in charge of the whole facility to make sure people aren't doing stuff that is unethical." "You just said you want to clone yourself, and you don't think that is unethical?" Ezekiel turned to Mordo and said, "No, I don't. I am making copies of myself, not making a copy of someone else without their permission. What about the soul for the body? You can't really create life if it doesn't have a soul." Ezekiel smirked as he asked, "X-23 is a clone of Logan, and yet she is alive and has a soul. Who is to say a clone of me won't have a soul?" Mordo shook his head but said nothing else. Steve spoke again and said, "As much as I would like to destroy everything, I am willing to trust Ezekiel with the technology in the base." Fury, Hank, Peggy, and Coulson nodded in agreement, while Xavier and his people didn't comment anymore on it. But it seemed like they didn't fully agree with the decision. Ezekiel, Logan, Kaecilius, Magneto, and Xavier were currently in the basement at Xavier's school in a conference room. Ezekiel called them together because it was almost time to move. A monitor that took up one of the walls turned on and displayed real-time footage of some vehicles driving through the mountains. "Sutter has been in the base for 2 days, and as you can see, I am tracking a convoy of trucks currently heading to the base. I am just waiting for confirmation that Stryker is with them before we move. I will leave it to you how you want to attack the facility." Logan smiled and said, "I can't wait to see the look on his face before I gut him." Ezekiel looked to Logan and asked, "While I wouldn't want to deprive you of your personal revenge, I have a way to make him suffer unbelievable pain before he dies and serve a useful purpose at the same time. If you don't mind not killing him yourself?" Logan smirked as he said, "Only if I get to watch." "Deal." Most of the group was quiet the rest of the time besides Xavier and Magneto, who were chatting amongst themselves. It took about half an hour before the trucks made it to the base. When they did, the video feed switched to the inside of the base. It showed the trucks as they entered the upper area of the base and parked at the loading docks. As they began to unload their cargo, which looked like mostly new supplies for the base, a man stepped out of the back of one of the smaller trucks. The camera zoomed in on him for a moment. It was their other target, Stryker, and he was commanding people to unload a couple of kids along with some adults strapped onto hospital gurneys. They were all unconscious and looked mostly normal, but one or more of them should be mutants. Ezekiel stood up and said, "Let's head out, gentlemen. I would like to take care of this before they harm those people." Everyone stood up before Kaecilius pulled them into the mirror dimension. He then made a portal and they all walked through it into the hidden base. Ezekiel looked at Magneto and said, "I think we wait for them to take them down the elevator, then we can start our attack. Will you need extra metal to make the bindings?" Magneto looked around at the men working in the base before he nodded his head and said, "They are not wearing enough metal to make proper restraints." Ezekiel nodded and said, "Take it from the middle section of the elevator. It should be far enough that they won't hear anything, and I will disable the sensors from the server to hide what happened." Magneto nodded before they all walked over to where the elevator was on the second floor. They had to wait for Stryker and some guards to load up the freight elevator and head down. Once they did, Kaecilius and Magneto entered the elevator shaft and Magneto floated them to the middle area of the shaft. Once there, Kaecilius pulled them into the real world and Magneto detached a couple 30-foot sections of metal from the elevator shaft. Once done, they went back into the mirror dimension and then joined the others back on the second floor. Ezekiel pulled out a tablet from his backpack and started to use it for a few seconds. The screen changed to show the current position of all the guards in the base. He looked at it for a few moments before he said, "The guards in the monitoring room should be our first target. No one is allowed into the room except the people assigned to that shift, and they still have 2 hours until shift change. From there I can point you to the next targets quickly without alerting anyone." Magneto and the rest didn't have any objections and followed Ezekiel's lead to the base's main security room. Once inside, Caecilius pulled the 4 people stationed inside the room into the mirror dimension, and Magneto quickly restrained them before they even realized what happened. Ezekiel smiled as he walked up the team lead and asked, "How are you gentlemen doing today?" The team leader laughed as he said, "I am not sure who you are, but you are fucking with the wrong people." Ezekiel smirked, did a hand sign, and turned into the team leader before he said in the man's voice, "I know exactly who I am fucking with. I hope they have lube because this is gonna hurt." The team leader was shocked before he could say something else. Ezekiel looked at Xavier and said, "Your turn." After Xavier knocked them out, Ezekiel handed him the tablet he was using and said, "I will stay here and guide you to targets, while also sending people to places for easy ambushing. It should make it easier to capture everyone without anyone catching on too soon. You really know how to take the fun out of a mission like this, don't you?" Ezekiel smiled at Logan as he said, "You should really get out more if you consider something like this fun." Ezekiel looked at Caecilius and said, "Send me out. I will send you the next target in a moment." Caecilius nodded as he moved his hands a bit, before Ezekiel was back in the real world. Ezekiel sat down in front of the main computer and started to work. Within seconds, a new green appeared on the tablet Xavier was holding. It was circled, and underneath it was the words, "You are here." Next, a small arrow started following a dotted line that pointed at 4 red dots in another room. The red dots were then circled, and underneath them were the words, "Bad guys." Xavier looked up at the group as he showed them the tablet and said, "I am not sure if he is patronizing our intelligence or trying to be funny." A little chibi Ezekiel dressed like a knight in white armor popped up on the corner of the tablet and said in a heroic voice, "A little bit of both, actually. Now go forth, mighty heroes, for you have a quest to compete, evil doers to slay, and a young princess to rescue." Everyone slowly turned to look at Ezekiel, who was sitting in a chair while typing on the computer in front of him. He didn't turn around, but raised one hand and made a motion for them to leave. Logan chuckled before he said, "We might as well get this over with." Magneto scoffed as he turned to leave and said, "He is so powerful, yet acts like a mere child." Xavier nodded his head in agreement before he said, "He might be acting childish, but he is right. We have a mission to complete." They followed the arrow to a storage room. The men inside looked to be in the middle of doing inventory. None of them were currently armed, and all of them were in the process of putting things away while making small talk. Caecilius pulled them into the mirror dimension, and Magneto restrained them in an instant, before they could even speak. Xavier knocked them out. After they were finished, everyone looked at the tablet, when it made a little noise and showed a new screen that said, "Bad guys 8 of 227. Underneath that was another thing that said, "Bosses 0/3. Below that was, "Princesses rescued 0 to 1. And below that was, "Hostages rescued 0/6. That screen shrunk down to the right corner of the tablet, and the map came back up, leading to the next set of targets. Xavier actually smirked slightly when he saw it before he shook his head and said, "Next target is marked." They moved through the top portion of the base quickly and started to take down all the targets Ezekiel was marking for them. They focused mostly on the rooms, and Ezekiel was in the control room routing people around to make them easier to pick off. It took almost 20 minutes, but they captured over 180 people, and no one noticed anything was wrong. Just before Ezekiel and his team started their mission, Sarah was able to see Laura. They were sitting in Laura's cell and talking quietly with each other as the monitor in the wall in front of them lit up. Ezekiel appeared on the screen as he said, "Good afternoon, ladies. If you don't mind, I would like to tell you a story." Sarah tensed up. She had secretly disabled the security for the cell so that she could talk to Laura in private. Laura, sensing Sarah's discomfort, snarled, and her claws came out of her hands and feet as she stood up. Ezekiel put his arms up on the monitor and said, "I mean no harm, I promise, Miss Kinney. I am just here to tell you both a story, nothing more." Sarah settled down slightly before she reached out to Laura and gently pulled her back down. As Laura sat down, her claws retracted, and she looked at Sarah in question. Sarah pulled her close and said, "Let's see what he has to say." For him to be able to gain access to use that monitor and security hasn't locked the whole base down yet. It means he has some decent skills with computers. Sarah looked at Ezekiel and asked, "Who are you?" Ezekiel smiled wide as he bowed slightly before he said, "My name is Ezekiel, and I am here to tell you both a story if you will listen." Sarah was quiet for a few moments, as she glanced at Laura before she looked at Ezekiel again and said, "What will we get if we humor you and listen to your story?" Ezekiel smiled again as he said, "Tell me what you want, and I will do my best to make it happen. Freedom from this place for me and my daughter." Before Ezekiel could reply, Laura had looked up at Sarah in complete shock and asked in a quiet voice of disbelief, "Do you mean me?" Sarah smiled down at Laura and said in a sad voice, "I'm sorry I haven't been a good mother, sweetie." Laura shook her head and said with her voice still quiet, "You are the best mother someone like me could hope for." Sarah's eyes became slightly moist before she blinked a few times as she pulled Laura into a tight hug. They were both quiet for a while before Sarah finally looked back at the screen to a smiling Ezekiel who said, "That is something I can make happen. So do we have a deal? A story for the freedom of you and your daughter from the facility, Mississippi Kinney?" "Yes." Ezekiel smiled wide again and said, "Great. Now please don't interrupt me while I tell this story. You can ask questions at the end if you wish." 00037. The History of a Tormented Man. Actually, before I start, what do you know about Laura's father? Yes, I know she was cloned, but what do you know of the person the sample was taken from? Laura said nothing, but looked at her mother for the answer. Sarah let out a sigh as she said, "I only know that they were a test subject for an older project called Weapon X, and that they went crazy at some point and killed most of the team behind the project. Only Stryker and Sutter survived the attack, and that was because Stryker was able to kill the subject." She glanced at Laura, then looked back at Ezekiel and said, "From my understanding, they could only save some of the project data and a sample of genetic tissue from the subject before they left the base. During the subject's attack, the self-destruct protocol was activated, leaving them with only what they could carry out. That's all I know. You would have to ask Stryker and Sutter if you wanted more info, and I doubt they would tell you anything." Ezekiel nodded his head as he said, "That is very interesting information. Now I can't wait to see what happens." "What do you mean by that?" Ezekiel smiled at Sarah and said, "That test subject isn't dead. He is very much alive and has a score to settle with Stryker for the bullets that were pulled out of his brain. How could he still be alive? He was shot in the head and then the base blew up. He shouldn't have been able to survive that. They have pictures from the aftermath of the explosion. That entire place was destroyed and nothing but a crater was left behind." Ezekiel shrugged his shoulders and said, "I have no clue honestly, and neither does he, but he is very much alive. His memories from before he was shot in the head are still missing, but it is something that we are currently trying to help him regain." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Anyways, let's get back on track. The man you were cloned from, I wanted to tell you about him, about his life. So hopefully when you meet him you could understand him a little and possibly bond over your common circumstances." Sarah pulled Laura a little closer as she asked, "I will not give up my daughter to some stranger, and I have no plans to separate you. But she should at least meet the person who she was created from. In the most basic sense, he is kind of like her father." Sarah shook her head as she said, "But he went crazy and killed a bunch of people. She shouldn't meet someone like that." Ezekiel gave her a deadpan look before he said, "Really? I get that you want a better life for her, but she is no longer an innocent and naive girl. That ship sailed the minute she was being groomed to kill people. But that doesn't mean she needs to be exposed to it any more than she already has been." Ezekiel shook his head and said, "How about you listen to what I have to say about this person before you judge him as a bad influence for Laura?" Ezekiel waited for a moment before he took her silence as agreement to listen. He took a deep breath of air and then said, "The man's name is James Logan Howlett, and he was born around 1882 in Cold Lake, Alberta, Canada." Sarah looked shocked and said, "He would be over 110 years old. I know he is a mutant, but he can't be that old. That would mean he killed over 100 trained soldiers when he was 80+ years old. Even with his ability to heal, that doesn't seem possible at all." Ezekiel laughed and then said, "You know he has a saying, I'm the best there is at what I do, but what I do best isn't very nice." It is frightfully accurate to describe him. He is the perfect weapon and little Laura here is the closest thing comparable to him. Yet even she still pales in comparison to the real thing. He had a pretty bad early life, frail and sick all the time. Considering the time period, it was a miracle he survived at all. I am still not certain what totally happened, but the night he awakened his powers, his parents were killed. After his parents died, he spent some time living in a mining camp before he spent about 10 years after that living in the wilds of Canada with a pack of wolves. I am still not 100% certain about all of that, but it should be about 90% accurate. A picture appeared on the screen of Logan during World War I. Ezekiel smiled and said, "What we know for certain is this is one of the first pictures ever taken of Logan, and was just after the Battle of the Somme was finished. At some point, he joined the Canadian military and served during World War I. After that, he spent time traveling around the world in the Navy." Another photo came up, and it was Logan with Captain America and Bucky. Ezekiel smiled and said, "Not really sure what happened, but when World War II broke out, he joined the US military and somehow ended up in the Howling Commandos. He stayed in Europe for most of the fighting till he was transferred to the Pacific Theater in 1944. A picture of Logan's transfer orders showed up on the screen. Then another that said he was killed in combat with the enemy. He was unlucky and left for dead when his company did a retreating action. Some more reports showed up, but they were all in Japanese. The Japanese found him blown in half and pulling himself to what was left of his legs. They shot him a few times in the chest and then watched as he came back to life. So they captured him and took him to a special research base in Hiroshima. He stayed there until the bomb was dropped. Yes, that bomb. Some new reports came up all in Japanese. The place he was at was actually within a mile from ground zero of the explosion. Some more reports came up and even a picture of a man with no skin and bone-like claws coming out of his hands. He actually survived that even though he was within the main blast range of the bomb, and that picture was taken by someone about a few hours after the bomb was dropped. Laura looked down at her own hands for a moment before she looked back at the screen and the picture of the skinless man. Ezekiel appeared back on the screen and said, "After the end of the war, he stayed in Japan and trained under someone named Lord Ogun. From there, his history is kinda hard to track. From our understanding, he met a woman and fell in love with her. But while she was pregnant with his child, she was murdered, and Logan apparently disappeared until the 1960s. At least I could find no trace of him till he showed back up in the Weapon X program. A new picture showed up with Logan and 3 other men. I don't have too much info about the Weapon X program, but I do know they did a lot of brainwashing, memory wipes, and implantation on their members. Some more reports and photos came up on the screen. One of them showed Logan in a tank with a mask over his face. This was taken right before he went berserk and killed everyone at the Weapon X facility. Ezekiel looked at Laura for a moment before he looked at Sarah and said, "I am sure you are aware how Laura was given her claws?" Sarah frowned as she said, "Yes, that bastard Rice did it. He didn't even sedate her." Laura frowned at the memories, but said nothing as the picture of Logan changed to a video of him being lowered into a tank of liquid. The video also displayed his vitals along with a lot of other information that was being monitored for whatever tests they were conducting. Stryker's voice could be heard on the video asking, "You sure this won't kill him?" Someone else laughed before they said, "I didn't know you cared so much for your little pet." Stryker was heard again and said, "I don't give a shit about that mutant freak. I just don't want to lose such a good weapon. Do you have any idea how long it takes to train someone to that level of skill?" "I do not, nor do I care. As for if this will kill him," the man chuckled before he said, "it wouldn't be the first time we killed him in an experiment. He should come back to life like he always does." "Fine, you can proceed with the experiment." "Thank you, Colonel." The liquid around Logan started to heat up slowly. All of the monitoring gauges were slowly increasing. After a while, Logan began to thrash around as the liquid around him was starting to bubble up. His heart rate had started to spike on the monitor. Someone could be heard saying, "Everything is within parameters. Start the injection process now." All of the tubes connected to Logan became filled with a silver liquid, and as the liquid reached his body, he threshed even harder than before. Even though he had some type of mask over his face and was in a giant vat of liquid, his screams could still be heard on the video. After half a minute, a man is heard over Logan screaming as he says, "All right, cut the flow of adamantium. That should be enough for the bone bonding process." Laura's eyes go wide and Sarah gasped slightly as she pulled Laura into a tighter hug. Laura slowly glanced down at her hands, which were clenched tight. Sarah noticed her daughter's reaction and gently put her right hand on top of Laura's. They both shared a glance before they watched in muted silence as the experiment finished and Logan's body was floating lifeless in the tank. The monitor showing his vitals was flatlined. Stryker could be heard asking, "Looks like you killed him again, Dr. Sutter. Hopefully it wasn't for good this time." This was expected. He should recover in half an hour. Let's head to the morgue. I want to show you something I found out about test subject 52 while we wait. The video began to fast forward for a bit. When it started, normally Logan's vitals were back, but his heartbeat was out of control and he was thrashing around inside the tank. The video switched to a different camera with an overhead view of the area and tank Logan was in. After a moment, Logan popped out of the tank screaming as his claws burst out of his hands, and he cut the cables and wires attached to him. Ezekiel's face popped back up and he said, "I have some more video, but it's pretty much him killing everyone in a berserker rage. How did you even get that footage? It should have been destroyed with the base." Ezekiel smiled and said, "Apparently it was being backed up to a different server off-site by the government backers. Neither Stryker nor Sutter knew about it, and after the base was destroyed, the program was canceled. I found everything about the program on some Pentagon servers. After making a copy, I deleted every trace of it, along with a bunch of other information the government doesn't need. I even found all the backup and hard copies and had those removed and destroyed." A newer picture of Logan appeared on the computer. He was standing next to a few people, and a large group of kids was with them. Ezekiel smiled, and as he started talking, new pictures of Logan with kids and different people were appearing on the screen. After Logan's rampage, he lost all of his memories and was found by Charles Xavier. He has since been living and working at the Xavier Institute for the Gifted, while Charles was trying to help him recover his memories. They weren't having much luck since Logan still had the bullets resting inside his head. But since I helped remove the bullets, he has been making progress and is slowly regaining his memories. The pictures finally stopped and Ezekiel fully appeared on the screen again. He glanced at Sarah before he looked at Laura as he asked, "So what do you think about the man who is kind of your father?" Laura looked up at her mother for a few moments, and they made eye contact but said nothing. After a while, she looked at Ezekiel and said, "I would like to meet him, but I want to stay with my mother." He will be thrilled to hear that. Well, thrilled for him will probably be a grunt in acknowledgement, but trust me, he will be happy. I know it sounds weird, but as you saw, he has been through a lot, but deep down inside, he is just a big gruff teddy bear. Ezekiel looked back at Sarah and asked, "So when would you and your daughter like to leave?" Sarah looked a little shocked but asked, "How soon could you help us escape, and where would we be going? We will also need help hiding from the people running this place, and what about my family? If I leave, they might target my sister and niece." Ezekiel laughed as he said, "I wouldn't worry about any of that. The people behind this place will think you are dead once we are done. As for when I help you escape, how about right now?" A portal opened up in front of Sarah and Laura. They could still see Ezekiel on the screen as he said, "All right, just step through that, and you will be one step closer to freedom." They couldn't see what was on the other side of the portal, but Sarah looked down at Laura and said, "Come on, let's go see where this takes us. Anywhere is better than here." Laura nodded in agreement as she stood up with her mother and then held hands as they walked through the portal together. 00038. Fixing Laura's issue and a job offer. As Sarah and Laura came out of the portal, Laura instantly stepped in front of her mother with her claws out. Ezekiel was the first to react and said, "The apple really doesn't fall far from the tree, does it?" They had stepped out of the portal into the loading dock area of the facility. In front of them was the entire staff of the base. All the guards were bound and on the ground in front of them. The higher-ups, Stryker, Sutter, Rice, Kimura, and all of the scientists were bound up away from the guards. Standing in front of Laura and Sarah was Logan, Magneto, Xavier, Kaecilius, along with Ezekiel, who was smiling at them. A few feet behind Ezekiel was a random set of chairs. Ezekiel stepped forward as he said, "Please stand down. We will not harm you." Laura quickly glanced at her mother, who nodded her head, before she looked back at Ezekiel and said as her claws retracted, "You don't smell like anything." Logan spoke up and said, I told him the same thing. He said it has something to do with him being a clone of the original or something. Doesn't make sense if you ask me. Everything has a smell. Laura stepped a little closer to Logan and began to sniff him. As she did, he stepped forward a little and sniffed her also. They walked in a circle around each other for a moment before they stopped almost where they started. After another pause, they both nodded to each other. As Laura started to move back to her mother, she said, You smell like smoke? Logan grunted before he said, Helps to dull the senses. Ezekiel stepped forward as he clapped his hands and said, Congratulations are in order. You rescued the princess successfully. Sarah looked a little confused as she asked, What do you mean by that? Ezekiel spread his hands out, gesturing to the area around them. This place is like a dungeon. He pointed to the guards before he then pointed at the other people and said, Evil minions here, and boss monsters over there. He then pointed at Laura and said, The little princess who was trapped in the bottom of the dungeon and needed to be rescued. Everyone waited for a moment before Sarah asked, What does that make me? Hey, you can be the princess's handmaiden, I guess. I just had you marked as a hostage before. Ezekiel turned around quickly and said, Speaking of which, you still have 5 more hostages to recuse. Sarah was left speechless for a few moments as another portal opened up and Logan and Kaiselius went through it. She finally spoke up and asked, Is this just all some kind of game to you? Before Ezekiel could speak, Xavier held up the tablet he was holding and said, Well, he did make it like a game. Sarah walked closer to look at it as Laura followed closely, guarding her mother. Sarah picked up the tablet, looking at it for a few moments before she handed it back to Xavier and then looked at Ezekiel as she asked, What is wrong with you? You really made this into a game? Well, how else can I justify giving them each a reward if they didn't do anything to earn it? Sarah wanted to reply but was too stunned to think of anything. After a few moments, Logan carried out a closed container filled with silver liquid. When he set it down next to Ezekiel, he said, We could use a hand with the others. Magneto said nothing, but just closed his eyes for a few moments before the hospital gurneys came out of the portal one by one and came to rest next to the container. Logan sat down. At this point, Sarah finally asked, Do we have to stay here, or can we leave? Unfortunately, we still need to sort some things out. Fix Laura's trigger scent issue so she doesn't kill someone by accident. We also need to collect the hidden agents who are watching people's families. Laura and Sarah immediately looked at Ezekiel as Sarah asked, What do you mean by agents watching people's families? Ezekiel laughed and asked, You did such a great job of sneaking Laura in and out of here. Did you ever stop to wonder how you were caught? Sarah thought quietly for a few moments as Kaiselius came back through the portal and closed it. She spoke up and said, I thought I missed something when I was covering up everything. Ezekiel shook his head and said, No, you did everything perfectly. You just didn't account for your sister's boyfriend. He is a sleeper agent meant to watch your sister in case you share something you shouldn't be. He reported what you did to Stryker. All the color drained from Sarah's face as Ezekiel talked. When he finished, she quickly said, We need to help my sister. She will be fine. She is not currently in danger, and we will collect him and everyone else next. Sarah calmed down slightly but still looked worried. Laura reached over and clasped her mother's hand. When she did, Sarah let out a breath and then smiled slightly as she looked down at Laura. Ezekiel smiled and said, All right, first thing first, let's fix Laura's issue. Ezekiel looked at Laura and asked, Would you be comfortable with me or Professor Xavier here going into your mind and removing everything to do with your trigger scent training? It should fix any future problems if you ever smell it again. Laura looked at her mother, who leaned over and whispered into her ear for a few moments. Laura listened for over a minute before she nodded her head and looked at Ezekiel as she said, Okay, do it. Ezekiel looked at Xavier and said, Please point Kaiselius to the next targets. I made sure all the targets are alone. I sent each of them a coded message to go to their safe houses and wait for an important information packet. Kaiselius nodded in understanding and walked next to Xavier and Magneto. As the first portal opened, Ezekiel looked at Laura and said, All right, let's sit over there and take care of your issue. Laura and Sarah followed Ezekiel over to the random set of chairs. Ezekiel sat in one chair, and Laura sat in the other chair with Sarah standing behind her. Ezekiel smiled and asked, Would you mind if we restrain you while I do this? There is a chance that you will go berserk when we do this, and I don't want anyone hurt. Laura looked up at her mother for a moment, who nodded her head in reply. She looked back at Ezekiel and said, "Okay. Magneto, could you please make some restraints for Laura, please?" Magneto didn't reply, but some metal flew over and wrapped around Laura's arms, legs, and chest, locking her into the chair. Ezekiel leaned forward and said, "Sorry if this is uncomfortable. It should be over soon." Ezekiel quickly did some hand signs and said something low under his breath before he reached over and touched her forehead. Laura's head dropped forward a little and Ezekiel's face went blank. Laura appeared in a blank white space with Ezekiel and someone else next to her. She immediately went on the defensive because of the unknown person next to them. Ezekiel reacted right after and said, "Laura, this is a friend of mine, Inoichi Yamanaka. He is going to help you with modifying your memory." Laura relaxed a little as she nodded towards Inoichi. He smiled back at her and said, "It's a pleasure to meet you, Laura." Inoichi spread his hands out and said, "This is your mindscape. It's currently blank because you have never been here before. I am going to give you a crash course on how to use it and help you remove some troublesome memories." Inoichi looked at Ezekiel and asked, "Are you going to stay and help?" Ezekiel looked at Laura and said, "Will you be fine if I leave you with Inoichi?" Laura nodded her head yes. Ezekiel turned back to Inoichi and said, "You can handle this. I will make sure everything else goes smoothly." Ezekiel removed his hand from Laura's head and looked around. It had only been a few seconds since he touched Laura's forehead. Sarah looked surprised and asked, "You are done already?" Ezekiel shook his head and pointed at Laura as he said, "She will be out for a little while. You can sit here with her till she wakes, if you like." As Ezekiel stood up, Sarah sat down in the chair and watched Laura with concern on her face. Ezekiel smiled and asked, "What do you plan to do once we are done here?" Sarah continued to look at Laura, but she looked a little lost as she said, "I don't really know. This is all happening so quickly. When you made the offer for freedom earlier, I almost thought you were joking, or it could take months." She took a deep breath and looked at Ezekiel as she said, "Now we are pretty much free, and I have no real idea what we're going to do. I know I can get a job pretty easily, but Laura has never interacted with other kids. I have no real idea what I am going to do for her. Normal school won't work. How about I offer you a short-term to possibly long-term solution?" Sarah looked at Laura as she asked, "I am not interested in playing games with you." Ezekiel chuckled as he said, "I can assure you what I am offering is not going to be a game. I do admit that I like to have fun, but if you saw what was coming like I have, you would also take every chance you get to enjoy life a little and have some fun." Sarah glanced back at Ezekiel and said, "That doesn't sound ominous at all. Are you trying to scare me into working with you or something?" "Not at all. If I wanted to do that, I would just show you a vision of the future. But the last person I did that to had a slight mental breakdown. So I am trying to hold off on doing that to people now." Sarah said in a flat tone, "You are not very funny. You know that, right?" Logan moved a little closer as he said, "It wasn't a joke. Mystique, the person who he is talking about. She has been seeing the professor for a while, now to help work through what she was shown. She still isn't fully 100% back to normal, and it's been well over 6 months since it happened." Ezekiel had a small frown on his face as he said, "It was an honest mistake. I thought she could handle it. I am being careful now, and don't plan to show anyone the possible future unless I absolutely have to." Sarah still looked skeptical but asked, "Hypothetically, what is your short-term solution?" Ezekiel smiled and said, "You could come work for me, while Laura could join a small group of kids who are currently being taught in a private school type of setting. As for the work you would be doing, I need some help, and you are one of, if not the leading specialist in the field of genetics and cloning." Ezekiel held up his hand as he finished and then said, "Or you and Laura can go to Xavier's school. I am sure he could give you a job teaching there, and Laura would be around other kids with special powers." Sarah watched Laura for a few moments before she asked, "So those are the only 2 options you have for us?" Ezekiel nodded and said, "Well, you could just leave and go do whatever you want. I would even give you money to live a decent life with Laura. But just so you are aware, the people who funded this project are still out there, and if you showed up somewhere, Well, they would definitely come looking for you and Laura. Sarah frowned slightly as she said, I thought you were taking care of the people behind this place. Ezekiel shook his head as he said, I am, but it will take time. This is just one of their operations, and I currently don't have enough information or manpower to completely take them down. We targeted this place because of the technology it holds, and because this operation is not part of the main group. Somi and Laura would have to hide all the time if we don't pick one of the options you gave us? Ezekiel laughed and said, no matter what, you will have to hide your identity. We plan to make it look like everyone involved here was killed. While the general public won't know about your involvement, the people who backed this place will. Sarah let out a sigh before she said, so carrot and the stick, or just the stick if we go out alone? No, I would do my best to watch out for you both. I can hide your digital footprint easily, but your actual one I can't do much about. You would need to change your name, dye your hair, live in an out-of-the-way place, spy movie type of stuff. Sarah gave Ezekiel a flat look as she parroted, spy movie type of stuff, really? Ezekiel gave a cheesy smile as he said, what? I am not a modern-day spy, so that is the best advice I can give you. If you want real advice, I will let you talk to a spy master for advice. But he might not help you because he is super paranoid and has issues making new friends. Plus, that guy is a creep. He likes to show up at people's homes and wait for them in the dark to make him look all mysterious and shit. Sarah just stared harder at Ezekiel the longer he talked. Ezekiel smiled awkwardly as he scratched the back of his head. He let out a breath then said, all right, maybe he wouldn't be the best person for you to talk with. Logan, who was standing close by, said, Peg could probably teach her the basics. Ezekiel nodded a few times as he said, yeah, you're right, that could definitely work. I just thought she might be out of practice compared to modern-day standards. Sarah looked between the two of them and asked, who are you talking about, and why would they be out of practice? Ezekiel smiled before he said, someone you will meet, depending on what you decide to do. I would like to mention that if you pick the first option, you will get to work with some of the smartest people on the planet. And I will also pay you 10 million. When you finish the project I need help with, I will be working with Reed Richards? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, someone just as smart, and we will leave it at that. Sarah looked back at Laura as she said, let me think about it for a while. Ezekiel started to turn around as he said, I will give you a few hours to think it over. By then we should be finished here. Sarah didn't reply, but nodded her head slightly as Ezekiel walked back over to Xavier and Magneto. 00039. Playing with people. The next hour went by fast as they picked up all of the sleeper agents and Ezekiel purged their databases. Whatever was useful was tagged for pickup and sent to the main base. Everything else that was left behind. Magneto used some metal to crush it into a tiny ball which they took with them. They made sure to leave no trace of the safe houses ever being used. While they were working on that, Sarah was worriedly watching over Laura as she was going in and out of a berserk-type state. The first time it happened, she was almost stabbed when she reached out to hold Laura's hand as Laura's claws popped out. She decided to stay away from Laura's hands and feet after that and was content to just watch for now with a worried gaze. When they were finally finished collecting everyone, Ezekiel had the first group of 20 guards transported down to the disposal area of the facility. It had a special blast furnace for the disposal of corpses. Magneto and Caecilius were standing next to the furnace as Ezekiel was at the controls opening it up. Ezekiel looked at Magneto and said, set one in feet, first with their heads sticking out. As Magneto was moving the first body into place, he said, this would be a lot faster if you just let me crush them. Ezekiel nodded as he walked up the first person set into the furnace and grabbed them by the head. He took a moment to adjust their head and angled it just right before he quickly jerked the person's head back as he twisted it. A snapping sound was heard as he said, I was the one to order this. I won't be a hypocrite and not do it myself. Magneto let out a sigh as he said, could you at least use a gun or something to speed up the process? As Ezekiel moved out of the way for the next body to be placed in the furnace, he said, anything else I use will make a mess I don't want to clean up. Caecilius spoke up and said, aren't we going to destroy the entrance to the base? Couldn't you just kill them all there? Ezekiel walked up to the next person and repeated his actions as he said, we could, but we would still need to dispose of the corpses afterwards. As Ezekiel was moving out of the way for the next body, Caecilius said, we could just pile them up and burn them after they are dead. Ezekiel was silent as he walked up to the next body and snapped their neck. As he stepped back out of the way, he said, "All right, we can do that after we finish this group. We will move everyone that we are keeping alive to the bottom portion of the base. Then I will take care of the rest." Before he walked up to the next person, he looked at Kaisalius and asked, "Are you going to use magic, or are we just going to pour an accelerant on them in a lighter?" Kaisalius shrugged his shoulders and said, "Doesn't matter to me, but if we used an accelerant and magic, that might be the quickest way." It took about 10 minutes for Ezekiel to go through all of the guards they had brought with them. After they sealed the furnace, Ezekiel set it to auto-run its cycle before they portaled back up to the base. Once upstairs, they started to transport Laura, Sarah, and the hostages all downstairs. They also moved the higher-ups, Sutter, Rice, Stryker, and the scientists downstairs. Once they were finished, Ezekiel took an M16 style Stark-made rifle from the security office, along with 4 60-round magazines. He walked out into the main area where all of the guards and sleeper agents were being held. Magneto, Kaisalius, and Logan were waiting for him when he came back. Logan spoke up and asked, "You sure you don't want me to do this, bub?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "I appreciate the offer, but I will take care of this myself." Ezekiel slid the first magazine into the rifle before he pulled back the charging handle. He checked the chamber before he released it and watched the first round slide into the chamber as it closed back up. He looked at Magneto and said, "Line them up." Magneto used his powers to hold up a group of people in a row as Ezekiel stepped closer and shouldered the rifle. He was only a few feet from the first person when he took aim at their head and slowly let out a breath as he squeezed the trigger. The bullet exploded out of the barrel and hit the person square in the forehead. Ezekiel didn't pay attention to what happened and aimed at the next person as Magneto moved the fresh corpse to the center of the loading dock area. Ezekiel aimed at the next person and repeated what he had just done. It went quickly, and within 10 minutes about 200 people were disposed of by Ezekiel. Ezekiel took a deep breath when he was finished. Then he looked over at the pile of bodies before he shook his head and looked at Kaisalius as he asked, "Want some help with the fire?" Kaisalius shook his head and said, "No need. I can handle it." Ezekiel nodded his head as he set the rifle he just used on the ground, next to the empty magazines. He walked over to Logan, who was sitting off to the side smoking a cigar. As he got close, Logan pulled the cigar from his mouth as he asked, "You sure we needed to kill all of them?" Ezekiel shook his head and said, "No, not really. But letting people who were ignoring what was happening here live didn't sit right with me. A quick death is all I could offer them as compensation." Logan raised an eyebrow at that as he asked, "What about the scientists, the higher-ups, and Sarah? You offered her a job and she is part of this mess." Ezekiel nodded at that before he said, "While true, she was only brought in for her ability in cloning. She only learned of the other shit they did here recently, and while you could argue she had to know something was going on, I checked the records. She was always required to stay in certain areas whenever they brought in new subjects or moved them around. Before her new clearance level, she always had at least 2 guards posted to watch her at all times." "All right, so she gets a pass from you then? What about the others? You told me Stryker was gonna suffer." Ezekiel gave a pharaoh-like grin as he said, "Don't worry, he will." Logan took a long pull of his cigar before he said, "Just let me know when so I can watch, bub." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "As for the others, they should be getting the same fate as Stryker. They were the ones who were doing all of the experiments." Logan let out a grunt in reply as he and Ezekiel watched Kaisalius using a magic spell to catch all the bodies on fire. Magneto had already crushed the pipes for the fire suppression system, and Ezekiel also disabled the software for it. So when the fire started in earnest, the only thing they had to deal with was the smell. After Kaisalius made sure he had caught all the bodies on fire, he opened a portal for everyone to head downstairs. When they came out of the portal, Laura was finally awake, and she looked at Ezekiel as she asked, "Can I be released now? This is uncomfortable." Ezekiel nodded as he said, "Give me just a moment." He walked over to Xavier and asked, "Can I have that vial, please?" Xavier pulled a vial out of his pocket and handed it to Ezekiel, who walked over to Laura and popped the lid off of it. Laura's nose scrunched up as she tried to move her head away from the vial. Ezekiel smiled as he put the lid back on it and said to Magneto, "All right, you can release her now. She is cured." Magneto nodded as he released Laura from her restraints. The first thing that happened was Sarah pulling Laura out of the chair and giving her a tight hug. Laura herself was a little awkward but still returned the hug, although not as enthusiastic as her mother. Ezekiel smiled at her response before he said, "All right, time to have some fun. Magneto, I want you to put Rice in that chair for me, and then set him next to that surgery light and facing the wall. Also, could you make something to restrain his head? I don't want him looking around." Magneto let out a sigh but did as Ezekiel asked, as everyone else was slightly confused with what was going on. Ezekiel just smiled as he picked up the tablet Xavier was using earlier and made all of the lights in the room they were in dim down. The only light currently on was a surgery light pointed down at Xander Rice's face. The rest of the room was only at 2% light. Ezekiel played with the tablet for a few moments before he looked over to Laura and asked, "You mind helping me out with something?" Laura glanced at her mother for a moment before she looked at Ezekiel and asked, "Maybe?" Ezekiel pointed to just behind Xander and said, "Stand there until I tell you to come out." Laura looked back at her mother, who just shrugged her shoulders and said, "It should be fine. I think it will be completely fine. Better than fine, in fact." Laura thought about it for another moment before she moved into position. As she did, Ezekiel glanced at Xavier and said, "Wake him up." Vivi. Xander slowly woke up. His head hurt a little, and he couldn't really see anything but a bright light in front of himself. He blinked his eyes a few times and tried to move, but he was restrained to a chair. He couldn't really remember what happened. Wasn't he at work? Or was he at Sutter's house with his wife? Everything was fuzzy, and it was hard for him to think clearly. Ezekiel had moved out of Xander's sight and waited quietly as the man woke up. It took about 30 seconds, but when he started to struggle in his bonds, Ezekiel spoke from behind the man and said, "I can assure you, those won't come off unless I allow it." Xander tried to turn his head to the voice and said, "Do you have any idea who I am? Who I work for? You have no idea how fucked you are, do you?" Ezekiel chuckled as he walked around Xander, but stayed out of the light. All Xander could see in the dim light was the shadow of a man just outside of the light pointed at him. Xander was sweating a little, but he wasn't really scared. He knew that if he could just waste as much time as possible, someone would come to rescue him. He was second in command of the facility after all. Xander smiled at the man and said, "I have no idea how you pulled it off, but if you don't let me go soon, you will die a horrible death." Ezekiel laughed again before he said, "You sound so sure of yourself for someone restrained to a chair. How are you gonna do it? Are you gonna send that little girl you have to kill me?" Xander froze for a moment as he squinted his eyes and looked at the man hidden in the shadow of the light. After a moment, Xander said, "I have no idea what you are talking about, but I know I am talking to a dead man." Ezekiel chuckled again as he stepped forward slightly and raised his right hand into the light. A vial was held up with his thumb and index finger, and he shook it slightly as he said, "You know, I found this in one of your pockets when I picked you up. I have no idea what it is, but I bet it's important." Xander's eyes widened a little as he started to sweat more. He forgot he was planning to use it on Sutter and then release the little monster to kill him. He was planning to take over as the head of the facility once he removed Sutter, and that cunt the little monster spawned from. Xander knew that if even a drop was spilled on him, he could be killed if they sent that monster to rescue him. As Xander was thinking, he started to hear distant gunfire and some muffled yelling. The man stepped back slightly into the shadows again. As Xander was about to speak, the man said, "Damn, I thought I might have more time, but it looks like that little girl is already at the perimeter." Xander smirked and said, "I told you, you should have never messed with me." The man moved back into the light slightly and said, "It doesn't matter. I still have enough time to escape. We will just have to finish our conversation again next time." As the man was talking, the gunfire was getting louder, but at the same time there was less of it. A second later, an explosion happened and the man was thrown off his feet. Xander watched in horror as he saw the vial move into the light and head towards him. It hit the exposed metal of the chair between his legs and shattered. The liquid in the vial splashed all over his groin. He froze in absolute terror for a moment before he started to yell at the man who was getting up from the floor. "You stupid son of a bitch. Do you have any idea what you just did? We are both dead. She is going to kill us both now." Everyone watched quietly as Xander was screaming his lungs out before he lowered his voice and said, X-23, stand down. I am your master. You will listen to me. Do you hear me? Stand down. Don't come near me. He started screaming again as he thrashed in the chair trying to get out. Laura actually smirked a little as she watched Xander freaking out before he finally stopped screaming. Ezekiel turned the lights back to normal and turned off the surgical light as he stepped in front of Xander. He slapped the man hard in the face as he said, "Hey shit stain. Wake up. You were dreaming." Xander was utterly confused as he looked at the person in front of him smirking. He looked down and realized that X-23 didn't gut him. He could have sworn she was just killing him. He tried to move, but he was still stuck in the chair. So he looked up at the person smirking at him and spat out, "What the fuck did you do to me, you mutant freak?" Ezekiel smiled as he said, "I was just showing you the future." Ezekiel held up the vial and shook it in front of Xander's face as he said, "We both know what this does, don't we?" The color drained from Xander's face as he stuttered out, Don't open that. If that little monster smells it, she will kill us." Ezekiel smiled as he opened it up and took a slight whiff. He pushed it under Xander's nose as he said, "It's funny. I don't smell anything. What about you?" Xander couldn't move his head away, but he said, "Please, put that away and I will tell you anything you want." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "Sorry, but I promised someone a play date." Ezekiel then poured the vial's contents all over Xander's head. Xander began to piss himself and shake as Ezekiel smirked before he said, "Laura, he is all yours if you want him." Ezekiel stepped out of the way as Laura walked around in front of Xander. The man was shaking even more as he went ghost white. He stuttered out, X-23, don't hurt me. I am your master, remember? You can't hurt me. Please don't hurt me." Laura looked down on him for a few moments before she leaned forward and said, "I'm not the monster, you are." Laura stood back up as she walked back to her mother, who smiled at her as she pulled Laura into another hug, which Laura actually returned properly this time. 00040. Destroying the base and a new friend? After Ezekiel finished messing with Xander, he knocked the man out again and had Magneto toss him with the other people. He then had Sarah help to wake up the other hostages. The people that were brought in by Stryker were a little out of it, but they talked to Xavier for a little while, and he calmed them down pretty easily. They even agreed to send their son, who was a mutant, to his school. Ezekiel wasn't 100% sure if Xavier used a little something extra or not on them, but he didn't care because their son's name was Robert Louis Drake, better known as Iceman. The real surprise was the container of silver liquid. When they opened it, the liquid slid out of the container and turned into a silver-colored girl with the body of a mannequin and bright red hair. She looked around at all of them for a moment before she asked in a sorrowful voice, "They killed my parents, didn't they?" Ezekiel walked closer to her as he said, "Yes, unfortunately we were too late to save them. I am sorry for your loss." The girl melted into a puddle on the ground, and Ezekiel could hear the puddle making a mournful bubbling sound. He sat down next to her as he said in a low voice, "Just let it out. It won't do you any good to keep it bottled up. If you need a friendly shoulder to lean on, or you just want to talk, I will gladly fill whatever role you need me to." Ezekiel sat next to the girl as the others were moving the prisoners to the holding cells in the base as Xavier was talking to Iceman and his family. Sarah and Laura were also off to one side talking quietly with each other. After almost 30 minutes, the girl slowly reformed next to Ezekiel. She was sitting down next to him, hugging her knees. He didn't say anything but put a comforting hand on her back and gave it a slight rub. She glanced towards Ezekiel and said, "My parents are dead because of me, and I can't even cry because of this stupid body of mine. Trust me, you had nothing to do with your parents being killed." The girl glanced at Ezekiel before she tucked her head into her knees as she said, "I heard them when I was in that container. They grabbed me and my family because of this stupid power. If I wasn't a freak, my parents would be fine and I would be able to feel something again." She lowered her head a little more into her knees as she murmured, "I hate being this freak of nature. Why can't I just be normal again? Everything was better when I was normal. Everything made sense when I wasn't a freak." Ezekiel shook his head as he said, "You aren't a freak. You are special. Some people might look at you and think otherwise, but those people are just small-minded bigots, just like the people here were. She buried her head a little deeper as she said, everything is numb now and I always feel cold. No matter what my parents and I did, I am always cold. I hate this so much. Why me? Why can't I just be normal again? Ezekiel let out a sigh before he said, maybe one day you can be semi-normal again. As for the drawbacks you currently have, well, everything comes with a price, and honestly, you are very lucky compared to some other people. At least your parents still loved you. She raised her head to glare at Ezekiel as she snapped back, well, I never wanted this. I just wanted to be normal. Ezekiel patted the girl's back as he said, you are right. You didn't ask for your powers. You didn't ask for any of this to happen, and this is certainly not your fault. Ezekiel gave a sad smile as he said, but now you are going to have to move forward, one way or another. I am not really sure how you will do that myself. Honestly, I don't think there's anyone who can tell you how to do it, but I gladly offer you help along the way if you ask. She let out a breath and then said in a slightly softer voice as she buried her head between her knees again, when I became like this, my parents locked me away and wouldn't let me outside anymore. They tried to hide me away from everyone. They took me out of school. I couldn't talk to my friends. They didn't want anyone to know their precious little girl had turned into some kind of freak. Does that sound like parents who love their kid? Ezekiel looked up at the ceiling for a few moments before he said, I can tell you one thing for certain. One thing that you should always remember and never forget. The girl turned to look at Ezekiel as she asked, what? Ezekiel let out a breath before he looked at the girl as he said, your parents both loved you very much. I saw the security footage just before they were executed. The only thing they were worried about was what happened to you, and if you were okay. If that isn't love, then I have no idea what is. The girl looked at Ezekiel with her mouth open in shock. She let out a mournful wail before her jaw and then face started to deform as she melted down into a puddle again and started to bubble sadly. While she was bubbling on the ground, Sarah came over and said, I know you are busy, but I wanted to say that I tentatively accept your offer. We can discuss the full details later. She glanced at the puddle with a regretful look before she said, when you aren't indisposed. Ezekiel nodded his head but said nothing else as he watched the puddle next to him. As Sarah started to turn around and walk back over to Laura, Ezekiel spoke in a low voice and said, could you go to the sample vault and grab the samples for 13-45-62, JK, and 13-45-61, MK for me and put them in a portable container? Sarah paused for a moment as she looked at the girl-turned puddle on the ground. After that, she nodded and walked out of the room. She came back a little while later and set a container down next to Ezekiel, who nodded his head in thanks. She then walked back to Laura and sat down next to her as she put an arm around her waist and started talking to her again in a low voice. After a while, Magneto, Logan, and Kaecilius came back into the room. Ezekiel said to the girl next to him, I will be back in a few minutes, just need to sort a few things out. When he didn't receive a response, he stood up while picking up the container and went over to Kaecilius. As he got closer, he said, you can send Sarah and Laura to the base. Introduce them to Steve and give him this. Tell him it's for Tobarama and that the chamber needs to be set up for 2 people. He will understand what you are talking about. Kaecilius took the container before he nodded in reply. Ezekiel then looked over to Xavier, who was still talking to Iceman and his family, as he said, when you come back, you can send Xavier, Logan, and their new student along with his family back to their school. Kaecilius looked over at the metallic puddle on the ground as he asked, what about the girl? Ezekiel shook his head as he said, her parents were killed here, and from the records I saw, she doesn't really have anyone else. We will take her with us first. I want to do something to help her. Once that is done, I will let her choose if she wants to stay with us or go to Xavier's school. Kaecilius nodded before he walked over to Sarah. As he did, Ezekiel walked back over and sat back down next to the girl, currently still being a bubbling puddle. He didn't say anything and just quietly waited for her to make the next move. After Kaecilius came back, he transported Xavier, Logan, Iceman, and his family to Xavier's school. After that, only Ezekiel, the puddle girl, Kaecilius, and Magneto were left. Kaecilius glanced at Ezekiel, who gave him a thumbs up before he opened a portal for him and Magneto. After about 10 seconds, low rumbling could be heard. A few seconds later, the ground started to shake. As the shaking got worse and the rumbling became louder, the puddle next to Ezekiel finally reformed back into a girl as she asked in a slightly fearful tone, "Is this an earthquake? Will we be okay here?" Ezekiel smiled and said, "We will be fine. That is just Magneto having some fun." He was the serious-looking old guy wearing that ridiculous red and purple suit with the cape. "I am pretty sure he has a cape fetish." Ezekiel gave a small chuckle before he said, "He is currently destroying the top portion of this place and the elevator shaft that comes down here. Once he is done, we will be leaving." The girl settled down a little, but at the same time gave Ezekiel a flat look as she said, "Really? A cape fetish?" Ezekiel laughed as he said, "What? Capes are so out of fashion. You have to have a fetish, or something if you wear one." The girl actually giggled after a moment and said, "You do have a point. Your name is Ezekiel, right?" Ezekiel nodded his head as he stuck out his hand for a shake as he said, "And you are Cecily Kincaid. It is a pleasure to officially meet you." She was quiet for a moment before she reached out and shook his hand while she said in a subdued voice, "Thank you for saving me." Ezekiel pulled his hand away, gave a cheesy grin at Cecily along with a thumbs up as he said, "That's what heroes do." She looked at him incredulously before she started to laugh. As she did, her whole body began to shake and deform slightly. She stopped after a moment with a frown on her face. Ezekiel gave her a pat on the back as he said, "Don't worry. You just need to get used to your powers, and it will become second nature to control it." They were both quiet for a while before Cecily asked, "What happens now?" "Well, I would like you to come with us for a little while. After that, I will give you a couple of options to choose from, and then it's up to you. Like I said, I can only offer you help along the way. You are the one who will have to move forward. No one else will be able to do that for you." Cecily nodded her head slightly as the rumbling noise and shaking earth finally stopped. A few seconds later, Caecilius, along with Magneto, appeared from a portal. As they did, Ezekiel looked over at Magneto and asked, "Do you have your speech finished?" Magneto nodded and said, "It's almost done. Beast and Mystique were double-checking it when we left." "Great. Send me a copy when it's complete. I just want to make sure you didn't add any homo-superior Nazi bullshit to the speech." Magneto gave a slight scowl as he said, "I told you. I no longer think that way and I was never a Nazi." Ezekiel smirked as he said, "You were really damn close to them with those speeches you used to give. I just want to make sure this goes right. This could have a big impact on how we move forward. After I double-check the speech, I will need a little while to finish up my end of things, and then we can go live. Make sure you dress to impress." As Magneto nodded in reply, Ezekiel looked at Caecilius and said, "All right, we are pretty much done here. Let's head home." Caecilius nodded and made a portal for Magneto to use. Once he was gone, Ezekiel stood up and made a few hand signs. A puff of smoke later, a tall man with the shape of a bodybuilder was standing there, dressed in all leather and a pair of mirrored aviator sunglasses. He looked down at Cecily, and as he reached a hand out to her, he said in a deep, accented voice, "Come with me, if you want to live." At first, she was in shock at how he transformed. Then she processed what he looked like and what he had just said. She began to giggle, which became full-blown laughter a few seconds later, before she turned into a puddle on the ground. Ezekiel turned to look at Caecilius and saw that even he had a small smile on his face. Ezekiel turned back to Cecily and waited for her to reform before he said, "That would have been terrible if you didn't get the joke." Cecily nodded her head as she said, "My dad was a big Arnold fan, so we watched all of his movies together." As she talked, her voice got lower and her body started to deform slightly. Ezekiel placed his hand on her shoulder and said, "Take a breath and just exhale it slowly. It will help to calm your mind." She followed his directions, and when she was fully solid again, Ezekiel helped her to stand up as he said, "All right, are you ready to get out of this place?" "Sure. Where are we going?" Ezekiel transformed back into his normal self as he said, "A super-secret decommissioned military base that we currently use as a base of operations, because we are a group of super spies, ninjas, and sorcerers." Cecily stopped for a moment and asked, "You are not being serious, are you?" Ezekiel smiled as Caecilius opened up a portal, and just before walking through it, he winked at her as he said, "Only one way to find out." Cecily looked at Caecilius and asked, "Does he always joke around like that?" Caecilius nodded his head as he said, "Pretty much. I have only seen him acting serious a few times. Even today, he turned our entire rescue operation into some kind of game for us to play." "Really? What made him act serious?" Caecilius smirked and said, "You did." Caecilius walked towards the portal and said, "Let's go. He is waiting for us." Cecily nodded as she walked to and then through the portal. Once through it, she was greeted by a strange-looking room with all kinds of symbols engraved on the walls and ceilings. She looked around in wonder as Caecilius came through the portal and it closed behind him.